Now, you filed a statement. I'll put on the screen here. You see that on the screen?
Not quite. Yes, I can. Now I have. Yes.
Good. And are there any corrections you needed to make to that statement?
No, there are not.
And otherwise, does this represent your true opinion?
Yes, it does.
All right. Now, you've set out here some of your qualifications. Could you just, in a few sentences, explain for the panel what your experience is in assessing wind farm noise?
Well, I think I started assessing wind farm noise in 2002 from one of the first wind farms in Victoria. Since that time, I've been involved in measurements of wind farm noise and more recently been involved quite heavily in the measurement of infrasound and low frequency from wind farms.
And so could you say how many different wind farms you've been involved with?
Over a dozen.
Okay. And then the other material before the panel, I'll put on the screen again, is headed Data Analysis of Willatook Background Noise Data. You see that?
Yes, that's right.
And this is the document that you've just heard was dated 22nd October, but provided yesterday, correct?
Yes, I finished it on Saturday.
That's all right. The fault's with us, not you, don't worry. And again, do these represent your true opinions?
Yes, they are.
Okay. And then the third matter is the presentation, which you're going to talk the panel through in a moment. But again, insofar as the presentation contains any new material, or perhaps we should identify what that is, I'll just put the presentation on the screen. This is your presentation, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
And it seems to me, but correct me if I'm wrong, that these graphs here, that's new material, yes? This one
yes, yes, it's basically in support of some of the experience I've got in measuring noise from wind farms.
Okay. And same with this one, indoor sound levels.
Yes, that's right.
And then further on, this comes from your data analysis paper, doesn't it?
That one does, because the submission basically by SONUS only covered a wind speed up to 15 meters per second. So basically I just took the actual data and extended it up to the wind speed that was actually measured.
Okay. You'll have a chance in a moment to explain what this means. I'm just making sure that we've identified the material that didn't live in your first statement.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And then I think the only other new material is you've got this one, noise model accuracy. That's new, yes. Not in your first statement.
My first statement actually questions the accuracy of the noise model, and this is basically examples of why I don't think that the noise models were accurate. That's all. Okay.
And then I think there's also this slide showing the Vestas 136 output. That wasn't in your first statement either, was it?
No, it wasn't. It's an example of a real situation from a Vestas turbine.
Okay, but insofar as I've just shown you the effectively new material in your presentation, does this represent your true opinion on the matters set out?
Yes, it is.
All right. Well, in that case, I'll stop sharing here and I'll turn over to you to go through the slides and make your presentation. And if you could stick to 20 minutes, that would be appreciated.
Thank you. I'll try my best. I'm trying to screen share, so if that can be allowed.
Yes, we can see it. You might want to maximize your screen to make it bigger or else to zoom in. Yes.
So you can see that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'll start if that's all right.
Please do.
Right, quite simply, the assessment of noise in Victoria is fundamentally based on the New Zealand Standard 6808 2010 at the moment.
Sorry, Mr. Hewson, just to catch up earlier than later, I'm not sure if others are seeing the sort of cut-off screen. It seems to be zoomed right in. You're able to reduce the size a little bit. I'm not sure. I assume others are seeing the same thing.
No, it looks perfect on my screen, Chair.
Okay.
So
I'm seeing it zoomed right in. Okay, I'll look. I've got your presentation here on the side, so I'll let you continue. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll try my best. Okay, so basically the questions remain over how the New Zealand Standard is implemented. The New Zealand Standard effectively has recommendations, and it is non-prescriptive in a number of areas. So it's open to interpretation in large parts, unfortunately. I just referred to noise limits, and the noise limits are based in terms of LA 90s, but prediction of noise from wind turbines to dwellings is based on the LAEQ. One is the statistical measure, and the other one is obviously an energy real sound level measure. Typical example noise conditions relating to the use of the New Zealand Standard 6808. This is an example one from February 2016 that Moyne Shire Council issued, and that's referenced in my statement. And basically it says, use the New Zealand Standard 2010, and then what it does is it specifically, it specifies that the sound level from the wind energy facility must not be more than background L90 +5 or a level of 40 dB. So what this condition, of course, is doing is actually clarifying the requirement for this particular wind farm, whereas the New Zealand Standard only provides a recommendation. So this has become a requirement rather than a recommendation. So the condition obviously solidifies a purposeful requirement rather than a recommendation. And it has a number of measures regarding the protection of sleep. The New Zealand Standard effectively is designed to protect sleep. And one of the measures here in section 12B is for the protection of sleep purposes, a breach of the standard, which is this 40 dB or background +5, for more than 10% of a night amounts to a breach of the condition. So that is a condition that is coined to try and protect an individual from sleep disturbance. Now, that particular condition was actually tested for this particular wind farm, and it was assessed by SONUS after a 12-month monitoring campaign, and the conclusion was that there was non-compliance, and that this is due to increased vegetation, not from the wind farm. However, my peer review showed serious failings with the assessment, and that the background source had actually the background sound level had actually reduced, not increased, since the original background measurements were taken. And the situation is ongoing with the litigation possible. So all I'm trying to explain here is that the original prediction for this wind farm used a ground absorption factor of 0.5 and a 1.5 meter receiver height using ISO 9613 Part 2, which is similar to that's being proposed by SONUS in this particular wind farm. My argument for this was that if G equals 0 was used in the original prediction, then the non-compliance that has been demonstrated could have been avoided at the planning stage. Furthermore, tonality was demonstrated in the compliance monitoring by both SONUS and myself, despite the original predictions assuming that there were no tonal qualities from this particular wind turbine. This here is another example of wind farm sound levels taken from a wind farm which was predicted using ISO 9613 Part 2 with a ground absorption of 0.5. The predicted LEQ level was 38 dB, and it was done by Marshall Day Acoustics in this instance for this wind farm. And the objective of a prediction is that it is supposed to be conservative. And the argument that was presented is that using G equals 0.5 is a conservative method using ISO 9613 to predict noise levels in the community that will not be exceeded. This is just a simple example showing that the predicted LEQ level of 38 dB fell short of the actual measurements in this particular evening. The actual level was close to 41 dB, yet the prediction was 38 decibels. Now, this was also not in a condition where there was downwind from the wind turbines to the receiver. It was effectively a crosswind situation. So this isn't the worst noise level for this particular wind farm, but it just does demonstrate that the predictions using this G equals 0.5 underestimates the actual measurements that have been achieved from this second wind farm. Furthermore, what this wind farm demonstrated was significant amplitude modulation, and this is just a small snapshot of that. And in the compliance assessment that was done by Marshall Day Acoustics, they did some listening tests and quite simply said, when we picked up our equipment and listened, we couldn't see any amplitude modulation. And so that went into the compliance assessment, and effectively it was passed. But obviously from this slide here, you can see that amplitude modulation is clearly evident for these surrounding residents. Now, what I mentioned in my submission was the possible use of a thing called DEFRA-NAN R45. DEFRA-NAN R45 is a recommended guideline for internal noise levels for low frequency from wind turbines in the UK. And the reason that I've suggested it is that if you look at the sound pressure level, which is the red part of the chart here, measured outside, and the blue sound pressure level measured indoors in one of the bedrooms of this property with the window slightly open, what you see is that the attenuation from outside to inside can be as low as just 2 decibels. And as much as 2, 4, 6, 8 decibels. Now, the New Zealand standard assumes that the outside to inside noise attenuation is 15 decibels. So for this particular dwelling, the New Zealand standard falls a bit short in the actual response indoors that people actually observe. Now, there's nothing in the New Zealand standard or anything in Victorian guidelines for wind farms that actually says that you should measure indoors to quantify the actual exposure of people. And that's why my suggestion in my submission was to possibly use a standard such as the DEFRA-NAN R45 to assess indoor low frequency noise. So, as I've said, with regards to noise predictions, all noise predictions are based on LEQ. And predicted sound levels are not predicted L90s, they're predicted LEQs. But the compliance level is termed L90, and the New Zealand standard defines in setting the recommended noise limit that LA90 is equal to LAEQ, although in reality, in physical terms, it's not. So the importance of the New Zealand standard is defining the measurement sites at which you take background noise measurements. And the reason for that is that later on, when you do a compliance assessment, you correct the measured noise levels with background noise levels to try to get a handle on the actual contribution of the wind farm itself. It's also used in assessing high amenity and obviously assist in planning a development. One of the things, if you don't have background noise levels for a property, then you can, in accordance with the standard, choose to do on-off testing, whereby obviously turning the wind turbines off gives you a background level. The problem with that, with this particular wind farm, is that you have other wind farms nearby that can affect the results. So on-off testing is going to be problematic unless, for example, you can turn off the MacArthur wind farm at the same time. Now, this is from the background analysis I did, and what I explained was that at D37, for example, the SONUS report basically covered wind speed up to only 15 meters per second. And what I found is that the data that's presented is it's almost identical to what I've presented, up to 15 meters per second. But beyond that, SONUS have not included this further data up here. Now, what's apparent for this particular location is that at wind speeds from 15 meters per second up to 25 meters per second, the ambient noise level does not increase much above 35 dB. Now, the analysis of background noise levels is actually non-prescriptive in the New Zealand standard. It's open to the person who's doing the analysis to produce one of these trend lines through the data. And this is typically a trend line in blue here that is prepared from all of the data, and it's simply using a trend analysis that Excel provides, and it shows the average background noise level. Now, what's apparent here is that you can see that the average from this trend line from 20 to 25 meters per second is higher than the actual data by a couple of dB. So to my mind, a review of the analysis of the background data might be warranted at higher wind speeds for this particular site. The other thing that I did here was that this is nighttime data only, whereas the SONUS submission basically used 24-hour data only. And if you do a comparison of the 24-hour data to nighttime data, the nighttime data shows that the average background noise levels are lower, which obviously one would generally expect. Just covering high amenity, the New Zealand standard refers to, obviously, New Zealand legislation and New Zealand planning laws, but fundamentally it's based on zoning rules. In the absence of zoning rules, you can apply simple objective tests, and that's where a high amenity might be demonstrated if the sound levels, if predicted sound levels exceed the average background level by 8 dB or more. Now, one of the things that the New Zealand standard says here is that it's common for noise levels, for wind speeds local to a dwelling to be much lower than those at the wind farm. And what they've suggested in the standard is that 6 meters per second might be a reasonable consideration of hub height wind speeds where you might get low wind speeds at the dwelling. However, if we look at this particular chart here for D37, for example, what you find is that you get really low noise levels, even up at very high wind speeds of 20 to 25. So it's one of the situations where you have to read between the lines of the New Zealand standard when applying a subjective, when applying an objective test for high amenity. There are a couple of other things that are associated with the objective tests, and that's the uncertainty, and that's the limitations of the instrumentation, so that if the low noise limit of the instruments are not capable of measuring sufficiently low, you might get an artificially problematic assessment with checking this level difference of 8 dB. VCAT decisions. Okay, Mr. Evans of Resonate has been an expert in this Narrowgid VCAT panel investigation, and he considered that the interpretation of the Cherry Tree VCAT decision was that farming areas shouldn't be considered a high amenity area. And having read the Narrowgid decision, I believe that Mr. Evans' opinion was rejected and that the panel re-evaluated the designation of what high acoustic amenity is in the farming zone. So noise predictions. Obviously, there's numerous noise models that are available, and New Zealand Standard 6808 doesn't require any particular model. The most commonly used ones are ISO 9613 and Konkawi, or hemispherical propagation as used in the New Zealand Standard of 1998, or the Australian Standard 4959, without wind enhancements can be used. All the models have inherent uncertainty, and typically, even if you've got the best accurate input assumptions, typically the uncertainty is greater than 3 dB at locations where people live. Now, to minimize the ambiguity of permit conditions, my recommendation is that noise model input parameters should be specified. So rather than allowing the New Zealand Standard simply just to be conditioned as a requirement, the noise model, I believe, should be specified in a condition, and also the input parameters to that model should be specified, and that's for the panel to decide. So what I've got here is noise models require sound power level data as input, and it commonly comes from the IEC 61400 Part 11 measurement of sound power, which is obtained under ideal operating conditions. Sound power levels of wind turbines in reality are altered based upon site parameters. So, for example, if the wind turbines are located too close to each other, then you get higher levels of wind turbulence on other wind turbines, which can increase the sound power outputs. Unlike the IEC 61400 method, which just measures a single turbine in ideal conditions. So just looking at the noise model accuracy, just referring back to D37, the data that I received recently from measurements by SONUS in 2017, which weren't provided earlier, has a situation where the MacArthur wind farm was operating, which is immediately to the north of D37, and the measurements of sound from the SONUS measurements was taken just to the south of the dwelling. So the dwelling's in between the MacArthur wind farm and the measurement location. And what I did was simply find a time during this measurement exercise in 2017 by SONUS where there was a northerly wind blowing from the MacArthur wind farm to the dwelling. And what I found was that if you track or chart the orange part here, that is the capacity factor, in other words, the percentage power output of the MacArthur wind farm over this nighttime period for this particular day. And what you find from the LA90 measurements that have been taken by SONUS, these are the blue measurements, is that as the MacArthur wind farm increases in its generating capacity, it tends to follow quite nicely the LA90 sound level that was measured by Sonus. Now, the maximum noise level that was obtained is just about 45 decibels here as an L90. If you wanted to correct for background to see what the contribution is of the MacArthur wind farm in this situation, you refer back to this chart, and you can say at night time what was the background noise level at the particular wind speed at which those measurements were taken. And those measurements were taken when the noise level reached 45 dB in a wind speed of 18 meters per second, which is about here. So that translates to something slightly below 38 dB as a background level. If you then correct this noise level for the background level at this same measurement location of 38 dB, it means that the contribution from the MacArthur wind farm is about 44 decibels. So now we have to look at the Sonus prediction from their submission, and they've predicted 37 decibels LEQ using the ISO 9613 model with a ground absorption of 0.5 and a 4 meter receiver height, and 36 dB using the Konkawi model with G equals 1 and 1.5 meter receiver height. So what I'm trying to look at here is how accurate is the Sonus prediction for their combined wind farm exposure at this particular residence. And they're suggesting that their modeling predicts at best 37 dB, yet the actual measurements from this location show that it should be 44 dB. So from my point of view, this is a demonstration that the Sonus modeling has used incorrect input parameters. Otherwise, they would be predicting 44 dB at this measurement location. So candidate turbines. Basically, the candidate turbine that's been proffered is one from Vestas, and it's a 6 megawatt unit, which I say in my statement doesn't seem to be available at the moment from Vestas. And the test results don't seem to be available either. What seems to have been offered for the Sonus prediction of sound power levels from this turbine seem to be manufacturers' recommended or estimated sound levels rather than test data. Now, commonly what would expect you to have for this sort of noise model is actual test data using ISC 61400, part 11. Unfortunately, none were provided for such tests for this particular candidate turbine. So the question that I raise is, are test results representative for this actual turbine that might be used? And furthermore, what was suggested by Sonus is that no special audible characteristics are expected from these candidate turbines. Now, this is all well and good if you accept promises, but I'm just questioning whether a condition should be implemented such that it's a requirement that no special audible characteristics be used in any future noise modeling for the real turbines, and that maximum sound power levels might be used as well. So just going on past optimisms of turbine characteristics, the Salt Creek wind farm used a Vestas 126 3.6 megawatt that shows tonality, yet the predicted levels did not include any assessment for tonality. The Ferguson wind farm has a Vestas V136 4 megawatt, and that also shows tonality. And again, predictions did not include any assessment for tonality. And the Berrybank wind farm, the Vestas V136 4.2 also shows tonality and also amplitude modulation. Yet the predictions did not include any SAC. And this chart, quite simply, is measurements taken outside a dwelling 1.6 kilometers from the nearest wind farm of the Berrybank wind farm, which contains these V136 4.2 megawatt turbines. And at a situation of 20% generation capacity, there are two images shown here. The top one is what they call a spectrogram, where the axis up here, the y-axis is the frequency, and along the bottom on the x-axis is time. Effectively just interpreting this, if you get these horizontal lines that you can see, they're tones. This wobbly line here that you can see faintly is a tone that's changing in frequency regularly as it moves. These bumps, incidentally, are cattle bellowing in the distance. Now, if you take a single slice vertically through that, you can end up with a spectrum that shows the level of each of these tones that are represented by these lines. And you can see that there's one here at 80 something hertz, and the first harmonic of that is here at 170 something hertz. And then there are other tones up here at about 850 hertz. And again, it's been predicted using this turbine for Berrybank that there are not going to be any special audible characteristics, yet clearly they've been demonstrated. And when you listen to this, you can hear some really unpleasant low frequency sounds that are modulated in amplitude. But again, that's my question over the validity of promises made by wind turbine manufacturers for their turbines. Now, just looking at draft noise conditions, obviously they're based on the New Zealand standard, and it's customary in Victoria for the recommended noise limits mentioned to be formalised in a condition, which is either 40 dB, or if it's determined that the area is classed as a high amenity area, then that might be changed to 35 dB. And it's customary in Victoria to separate nighttime compliance to 24-hour noise compliance limits. And that's fundamentally required because the New Zealand standard is designed to protect sleep. Now, one of the further protections of sleep that I consider is reasonable is this 12B that I've explained way up in the top here, where this recently issued condition from the Moyne Shire suggests that for sleep protection purposes, a breach of the standard set out in 12A for 10% of the night amounts to a breach of the condition. Now, to me, that adequately protects sleep and is a condition that I would favour. So given the lack of prescription in the New Zealand standard, I suggest a condition which specifies the noise model to use. So you don't specify, any model you like, you particularize it, and you might say, use the ISO 9613 model, for example. And also specify the receiver height, and 1.5 would be my recommendation, since everyone measures at 1.5 meters in compliance assessments and for background. The original EPA South Australia 2009 guidelines also specify requirements for modelling, and commonly they require that G equals 0 is used, and this guideline is also used in New South Wales. And they have a receiver height of 1.5 meters. And my suggestion is that ISO 9613 should be used with a receiver height of 1.5 meters using ground absorption of 0 and actual test data for any proposed wind turbine, with an appropriate addition of uncertainty that I consider should be in excess of 2 dB. That increase of 2 dB, I believe, is appropriate for uncertainty of different turbines that are measured, because there's a variability in the sound power output of any particular turbine, one to the next, coming off the same production line. And also you have the situation of increased turbulence due to other wind turbines, depending on how closely packed the wind farm is arranged. And also that unless test data from production wind turbines show no special acoustic characteristics, then it should be presumed that an SAC penalty should be applied to any noise model pre-construction. I don't think we should believe promises made by turbine manufacturers. Now, one of the things that I've come across which is of deep concern to me, and that is getting information from the operation of the wind farm when I'm doing independent compliance assessments. Invariably, they refuse to provide this data, citing confidentiality and whatever other reason. But basically, it's very hard to get SCADA data from wind farm operators and developers once the things are running, so that you can do independent testing. So my recommendation would be that a condition is included in the permit, if it's approved, that SCADA data must be made available for any independent assessment. And so that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Hewson. Could I just get you to explain to the panel what is SCADA data?
SCADA stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. And basically, there's a multitude of sensors all over any particular wind turbine. They measure things such as temperature of the oil of the gearbox, sway of the tower with accelerometers, yaw angle, in other words, the direction in which the nacelle points the turbine, the rotation of the rotation speed of the blades, the angle of attack of the blades.
Does it include the percentage that it's of power that it's operating at that you had in an earlier slide?
Yes, it produces it produces a power generation output in kilowatts, and then to get the percentage, you just relate that power output to the maximum rating of that turbine. Okay,
thank you. Now, what I wanted to do before handing you over to Mr. Power is just put half a dozen propositions that I had put to Mr. Turnbull, and he'd expressed an opinion that was somewhat controversial, and just see what your view is so that the panel doesn't have ships in the night. The first question for you is this, that it was set out in a paper by Willatook and others that the science of the production of noise from wind farms wasn't well understood, and Mr. Turnbull disagreed with that and opined that it was well understood and well modelled by the ISO and Konkawi approaches. What's your view? Is the science well understood or not?
The science isn't well understood. But back in the early 2000s, a wind farm noise conference was organised, and everyone thought everyone knew everything by then. And unfortunately, it's still in operation some 20 years later. So every year now, yet more and more is known about wind turbines and the noise from them. All right.
I specifically put to him, there was a paper by Cesarego and others suggesting that you get interference either from the three blades on one turbine or else interference from multiple turbines, and that might create interference patterns which lead to unexpected concentrations of sound. And Mr. Turnbull's opinion was that that was all wrong and none of it was possible. So what's your view, Mr. Hewson? Can you get unexpected concentrations of sound?
Yes, the assumption with using the ISO 9613 model is that the sound source is centered at the hub, and that it is an omnidirectional sound power source, which isn't actually the case. The sound from a wind turbine is very directional, and the interaction between multiple turbines in terms of their directionality can give you a very complex sound field at the location where people live.
Okay. The next two questions are about the background testing. You'll recall that Sonus did their testing in 2010, and I asked Mr. Turnbull whether the current backgrounds might be different because, for instance, people had engaged in home renovations that blocked noise or even erected walls. And his opinion was that the erection of structures like that would not change the background sound levels at a residence. What's your opinion as to whether constructions like that can have an effect?
Well, if someone builds a wall somewhere near where the background measurements were previously taken, obviously the effect will be significant on subsequent measurements. So it all depends on what was constructed as to whether it would have an effect on future measurements. But there are situations where it could have an effect, but you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. His testing, you might remember, was done in spring, and he was asked whether that was representative of the soundscape that you might get through the year. And his opinion was that it was that you had different sounds at different times, insect noise, etc., that effectively cancel each other out, so that he didn't accept there was any seasonal difference in terms of when during the year one would do the testing. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yes, testing of background noise levels at different times of the year do produce different results. There are many reasons for that. The prevalence of insect noise, for instance, is one. Another one is frogs. Frogs are horrible because they tend to be at a lower frequency and you can't actually delete them in analysis subsequently. Other things occur, such as if you've got deciduous trees, you've got foliage in one situation and no foliage in another. So different times of year can give you different results. Another thing that happens is that the nighttime period goes from 10 o'clock through till 7 in the morning. So the morning chorus changes depending on daylight hours. So in daylight saving mode, for example, it might be different to the situation when you've got non-daylight saving, in that one set of background data could include morning chorus, but others might not. So yes, there are differences throughout the year.
All right. The last two questions are about the New Zealand standard. And the first of those questions is whether, at least using the regression approach in the New Zealand standard, whether that's an appropriate way to deal with intermittent noise nuisance that might be produced. Mr. Turnbull's view was that the New Zealand standard was an appropriate standard to use if one was seeking to protect sleep. What's your view about the adequacy of the standard, particularly given the risk of short bursts of noise in the night?
Well, the New Zealand standard, there's a bit of history here. So back in 1998, when the first standard of New Zealand 6808 was coined, it had a section in there which said that the standard is only applicable to locations where you can't discern the amplitude variation of sound. So if you can hear the sound level of a swish, for example, then that means that the New Zealand standard shouldn't be applied. That's from the 1998 version. Moving forward to the 2010 version, they now don't refer to that, but they include an assessment of SAC for amplitude modulation. So I'm sorry, I missed the thrust of your original question. Could you repeat that again, Noel?
Yes, well, I'll put it a different way. The New Zealand standard, as we've seen, at least at the compliance stage, tries to determine whether on average over the 10 days that you've tested or whatever period it is, whether it on average it complies with the noise limit. And what was put to Mr. Turnbull and what's put to the panel is that averages are of little comfort if you're dealing with short periods of loud noise, which might get averaged out so that you could conclude under the New Zealand standard that there was compliance with that standard, and yet have periods of time within the testing period where there was unacceptable noise levels. So given that averaging is a feature of the New Zealand standard, the question for you is whether you consider that it is appropriate nonetheless to embrace the standard as something to go into the potential permit for this wind farm.
Okay, so averaging of noise over a survey period of, say, 4 weeks or so includes averaging over different wind directions, different wind conditions. So, for example, you might be averaging the situation where you are downwind from a turbine and then you're upwind from a turbine. Due to the directional effects of the noise output from a wind turbine, one might be, say, 6 dB lower than the other case. And then you're tending to average all of those together and produce a result. So none of the averaging will actually indicate the protection of sleep, for example, for any particular night. However, again, this is the ambiguity of the New Zealand standard. If you look at other parts of the standard, it suggests that it's specifically designed to protect sleep disturbance. So it's protecting sleep. Then you look at situations where you've got the possibility of doing on-off testing. Now, on-off testing can be done in one night. So, for example, if someone wants to do a compliance assessment of a wind farm at a particular dwelling, they should look at the worst case scenario, which might be downwind from the wind farm. They might look at the measurements over that period for that particular night and effectively do on-off testing throughout the night. And then you can get a background and then compare it to the wind farm's effect. So the on-off testing approach can be used in shorter time periods, which can represent individual nights. So the New Zealand standard allows you to do individual night assessments, although there's a generic underlying method which uses averages. So there's a bit of a conflict there.
Yes, that was the last question, in fact, about on-off testing. I put to Mr. Turnbull that it was preferable to start with on-off testing. His view was that it wasn't, because on-off testing had its own difficulties. What's your view about whether on-off testing should be available, at least when a testing acoustician wants it?
Yes, it should be available. And in the Salt Creek wind farm, where Sonus actually did an assessment, and so did I, on-off testing was done, and it was quite useful.
Last question, I promise. Under the New Zealand standard, on-off testing only occurs with the consent of the operator. Are you aware of any cases where an operator has refused to provide the testing?
Not if it means that other information suggests that they may be non-compliant and that they're forced to do it because otherwise they may fall foul of a condition.
Okay, so there's a bit of pressure on them to agree. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there should be pressure. It's a situation which is a reasonable thing to do, and it's in accordance with the standard. Generally, the standard only requires it if background measurements haven't been made. The problem in this scenario is that on-off testing might not be possible if you've got other wind farms in the vicinity. So, for example, at D37, if you're trying to do on-off testing in that situation, you've also got to turn off the MacArthur wind farm, which I can see is going to be problematic.
Yes. But as a testing acoustician, would it assist you if, for instance, a wind farm permit required the operator to allow on-off testing upon request?
Yes, that would assist.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hewson. That's all from me.
Thank you. We're taking a break until 11:48 a.m. Sorry, I meant to add 2 minutes to 11:50, not subtract. So I may have cut the break a little bit shorter than normal. We'll make up for it this afternoon. Just want to see which post seek to ask questions of Mr. Hewson. I'll start with Moynshire. Mr. Wilson, will you be seeking to ask questions?
No, thank you, sir.
No, thank you. I'll just, before I get to Mr. Power, just ask any other parties seeking to ask questions of Mr. Hewson. All right, Mr. Power, about how much time would you need?
I've said an hour and a half to 2 hours.
All right, 2 hours.
I don't think we'll be done by lunch, but hopefully not too long after.
All right, thank you. And the questions of the IP will be asked through Limber West. All right, so when you're ready, Mr. Power.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think I'm unmuted now. Mr. Hewson, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, thank you.
Thank you. And inquiry members and Mr. Fetter, can you hear me? All right, thank you. Mr. Hewson, my name's Tim Power, and we have met before, but a while ago, I think, and I'm appearing for the proponent in these proceedings. I just want to have some questions about your witness statement, but can I just clarify, just to get one formality out of the way, you indicated earlier that your witness statement of 28 September represents your true opinions and you had no corrections to make to it. And I confirmed that I assume that the declaration you made that there's no matter significance which you regard as relevant have to your knowledge been withheld from the panel. That remains the case as well. Is that right?
Yes, that was my belief.
Yeah, okay, no, that's fine, thank you. Now, you're very experienced at giving expert evidence and wind farm planning inquiries like this, aren't you?
I wouldn't say very experienced, but I have done them before.
You've done a number of them, that's right. And you've explained that you've done wind farm noise measurements around wind farms. For the purpose of preparing your evidence, did you confer or seek advice from DELP or the Victorian EPA about its approach to assessing wind farm noise under the Victorian planning assessment?
No, I didn't.
Okay. And for the purpose of preparing for these proceedings, you refer to the South Australian EPA wind farm noise guidelines. Did you consult with the South Australian EPA about those guidelines?
Not before preparing my submission, but
Yep.
Subsequently I have. I've spoken to the author of the amended guidelines, yes.
The November 2021 guidelines. Because you refer in your statement to the 2009, but I think we've established earlier in the hearing there's a more recent version. That's the case, isn't it?
That was one of my queries of the author, was that he's got amendments in a document that's got the same document reference number and is called 2009, yet it's been updated recently.
Yeah,
so,
okay, it's not very helpful of him. Okay, fair enough. Now, I just want to ask you most of my questions are going to relate to the wind turbines, which should come as no surprise to you, but I do want to clarify your evidence relating to the ancillary infrastructure. When I say ancillary infrastructure, I mean the substation and the battery. Now, in paragraphs 144 and 145 of your witness statement, you explained that the treatment of the substations is generally acceptable, that remains your evidence, I assume.
Only in as much that I'm suggesting that DEFRA NaN R45 might be an alternative for assessing indoor low frequency because of the potential for indoor resonances that can be affected. And I've experienced in the past from transformers where it's caused problems for residences, and it turns out the indoor resonances of the rooms have actually caused the problem.
Okay, so your evidence is that you're satisfied with the noise levels and the predictions undertaken by SONUS for the BESS and the substation, but that in addition to the noise levels established under the noise protocol, you also recommend a criteria or a condition relating to low frequency sound based on the DEFRA publication.
Yes, which is an indoor measurement. It's not outdoors. That's right.
Yeah, no, I understood. Okay, and now in the joint witness statement, Mr. Turnbull and Mr. Evans disagree with you because they say that low frequency matters are already addressed under Victorian EPA guidance. Now, they're right about that, aren't they?
No.
Okay.
The reason that they're not right is that the assessments are all completed outdoors, and my argument of using DEFRA NaN R45 is that it's what matters indoors when people are trying to sleep, not the outdoor noise level. Okay,
let's just clarify this to make sure that we're all on the same page. It might be I'm misunderstanding something. Can I just share my screen and hope I'm sharing the right screen here. Now, can you see on your screen a document called Procedure for the Assessment of Low Frequency Noise Complaints?
Yes, that's right.
And it's prepared for DEFRA by Dr. Morehouse, Dr. Waddington, and Dr. Adams. Is this the DEFRA NaN R45 document that you're referring to in your statement of evidence?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay. Excuse me, I'm going to scroll down, and it can be a little annoying to look at. And this document includes a criterion curve. With table 2, it includes particular LEQs for different hertz. Is this the indoor criteria that you think is important for the BESS and the substation that should be reflected in a condition?
Yes, that's my suggestion.
Yes, okay. I'm just going to skip to this document. So this is EPA publication 1826.4. In fact, it's the wrong one. Can I dig to this one? It's EPA publication 1996, June 2021, called Noise Guidelines Assessing Low Frequency Noise. Do you see that? Are you familiar with this guideline?
Well, as familiar as I can be, I suppose, yes.
Okay. That doesn't work, so just bear with me a moment. I'm going to have to scroll again. So you see the heading indoor low frequency threshold levels, and and it says the noise threshold levels for indoor low frequency noise are based on the levels proposed by Morehouse, Waddington, and Adams, 2011. Now that would be the DEFRA publication that we just had up on the screen a moment ago, wouldn't it?
Yes, that's right. So if that publication is actually used in a condition and it's stipulated that indoor measurements are done in accordance with that, then that would meet my suggestion.
Okay. So when in the witness statement you said, they said, sorry, scroll down, special audible character, where are we? I think I might have been there the first time. Yes, ancillary noise equipment. Mr. Turnbull said Victorian guidelines adequately address low frequency noise, and Mr. Turnbull agreed, Mr. Evans agreed. You say EPA 1996 does not consider indoor low frequency noise. From what I've just taken to you, that does not appear to be the case, does it?
That is right, yes.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. But of course, the EPA publication does say one important thing, which I think you will disagree with. And excuse me, switching around again. I'll just zoom it so you can read it. So it says this assessment, the assessment methods and guidance set out in this guideline only applies to noise emitted from commercial, industrial and trade premises. So that would capture the BESS and the substation, wouldn't it? Under the noise protocol,
yes.
and yes.
Yes.
And it would capture the quarry as well, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And then it goes on to say the guideline does not apply to, in the third dot point, noise from wind turbines. Do you see that?
Yes, I see that.
And it says the New Zealand standard 6808-2010 is used to assess wind turbine noise. Do you see that?
Yes.
So it's open for the inquiry to infer from this guideline, is it not, that this guideline should apply to commercial, industrial and trade premises such as the BESS and substation, but not to the wind turbine noise, because that's addressed under the New Zealand standard, yes?
And that's why I'm suggesting that DEFRA NAN R45 might be a preferred condition.
I know you're suggesting that, but I'm asking you whether it's open for this inquiry to infer from this statement that the EPA doesn't think that's necessary for the wind turbine noise, because noise is assessed under the New Zealand standard.
I don't think it's how you interpret it. That so, for instance, it says here when this guideline applies. So all this statement here says that the guideline doesn't apply when assessing noise from wind turbines. So quite simply, don't consider this guideline at all for wind turbines. Now, in the absence of having something for noise from wind turbines, they're suggesting that 6808 might be applicable, but 6808 doesn't refer to the low frequency noise. So that's again why I'm suggesting specifically that something like DEFRA NAN R45 might be an appropriate condition to insert and use.
Is it quite right to say that the New Zealand standard doesn't refer to low frequency noise? I'm looking at clause 5.5 of the New Zealand standard. It acknowledges that turbines may produce sound at ultrasound and infrasound frequencies considered to be outside the normal range of human hearing. These components will be well below the threshold of human perception. So is your evidence on this topic not related to infrasound, but related to low frequency sound above 20 hertz or whatever the threshold is for infrasound?
Yes, the DEFRA NAN guideline starts at the 1/3 octave at 10 hertz.
10 hertz, okay. All right. Now, I want to ask you some questions about wind farm noise levels now. So I'm asking questions about noise from the wind turbines. You acknowledge in your statement that SONUS has adopted the 40 decibel noise limit. And I've got before you, are hopefully on the screen, clause 5.2 of the New Zealand standard. Is that on your screen?
Yes, it is.
And that states that as a guide to the limits of acceptability of a noise sensitive location, a dwelling is a noise sensitive location for the purpose of the standard, is it not?
Yes, it is, and that is a guideline, yes.
Yes, so it's a guide to the limits of acceptability. At any wind speed, wind farm sound levels should not exceed the background sound level by more than 5 dB, or a level of 40 decibels, whichever is the greater. And it's the 40 decibel level that's been adopted by SONUS in the wind farm in its assessment of this project, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and that is, I'll call it the default noise limit under the New Zealand standard, is it not?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a limit. It's a guideline. It's
right.
up to to decide if it's a limit or not.
Fair enough. So you want to call it a limit? I'm happy to call it a guideline. I'm happy to call it a guideline for the purpose of questioning. No, I'm not conceding it. But as a guide to the limits of acceptability, the guideline value of 40 decibels is what's been adopted by Mr. Turnbull in the SONUS environmental noise assessment of this project. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And that limit in 5.2 is referred to earlier in the standard. And do you see 5.1.1 there? It says limits for wind farm sound are required to provide protection against sleep disturbance and maintain reasonable amenity at noise sensitive locations. Now, I don't think there's any disagreement between us about how important that is, yes?
Yes, it's important. And what they've done is make an assumption of noise level attenuation from outdoors to indoors to protect sleep.
They have. And they go on in 5.1.2 to provide a satisfactory level of protection against sleep disturbance. This standard recommends a limit of wind turbine sound levels outdoors at noise sensitive locations at 40 decibel, and it refers to clause 5.2, yes?
Yes, with an indoor to outdoor attenuation of 15 decibels.
That's right. And that 15 decibel indoor to outdoor attenuation, that's consistent with guidance published by the World Health Organization, is it not?
Yes and no. The World Health Organization gives a generic attenuation for road traffic noise from outside to inside generally for the European experience,
Yep.
where houses are generally, brick built and all the rest of it with double glazing and things.
Yep.
It's not necessarily representative of Australian housing. And the other thing that the World Health Organization does is say that in the event where you've got larger preponderance of low frequency noise, that the attenuation from outside to inside could be significantly lower.
Yes, but that 15 decibel rule, if I can call it, that's applied frequently in Australia to all manner of different sound sources, quite putting aside wind farms, is it not?
Well, yes, for road traffic noise, and again, it depends.
Industrial noise, train noise, yes.
In Queensland, it's also been deemed to be lower than 15 decibels as well, and has been applied at lower levels. The thing that I might refer you to is that outside to inside noise measurements that I showed in my presentation. It showed that the outside to inside attenuation from these amplitude modulations, which is clearly associated with the wind turbines, can be as low as 2 decibels and up to 8 decibels.
Yeah.
So for that house, obviously not.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I do want to ask you questions about amplitude modulation, but that's probably about an hour and a half's time. So I'm just asking you some questions about the New Zealand standard for now. Now, I put it to you that clause 5.2, the 40 decibel limit in 5.2 is a default guideline value. Now, it's default because the high amenity area limit established under clause 5.3, which is the limit you favour as I understand it. What the standard says is that it starts in the first sentence. It says that the 40 decibels in clause 5.2 is appropriate for the protection of sleep, health and amenity of residents at most noise sensitive locations. In other words, in the majority of situations, the authors of this standard are saying that 40 decibels will be good enough to protect sleep, health and amenity. That's clearly what the standard's saying, is it not?
Yes, it is.
And that you only consider a high amenity area in special circumstances. So I'd suggest to you what that means, that in the minority of situations, a high amenity limit should be considered under this standard. That's what the authors of the standard are suggesting, is it not?
I think the authors are suggesting that it's, site by site dependent.
Sure, okay, that's probably fair enough, but it's site by site dependent. But they're also saying that their expectation is that in most situations, 40 is going to be good enough. And in 35, you consider it in only special circumstances. And we'll discuss what special circumstances mean shortly. But that's what they're indicating here, is it not? Just on the plain language of the clause.
Well, yeah, obviously, yes.
Yeah, okay. Now, I'll just stop sharing that for the moment. No, I won't stop sharing. Now, SONUS in its environmental noise assessment, and Mr. Evans agrees with this, they reference the wind farm guidelines and the cherry tree decision in deciding that a high amenity area limit was not applicable here. Now, in that cherry tree case, have you read the cherry tree? In fact, you were a witness in the cherry tree case. What am I saying? You recall that?
I wasn't a witness with regards to the proponents or the objectors I was actually invited there to present some infrasound measurements that I'd taken.
But you were invited by the Warburg Foundation, weren't you?
Yes, but only in regard of the
Yeah, no, that's
infrasound
true.
measurements that I'd recently taken, that's all.
No, that's consistent with my recollection as well. But the Cherry Tree, you're familiar with the tribunal's decision in Cherry Tree, yes?
Yes, I've read it.
Yes, you've read it. And what the tribunal said in Cherry Tree was effectively that applying a high amenity limit wasn't suitable in a farming zone because the farming zone didn't, to use the language of the New Zealand standard here, promote a higher degree of protection of amenity related to the sound environment. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, I think that they applied the New Zealand standard, what they term as mutandis mutandis, didn't they?
That's right. That's right. That's right. Now, now you're critical of the approach taken by Mr. Evans in your statement, but it's relevant for us all, is it not, including you, to have regard to the planning scheme controls for this permit application, is it not?
Yes, that should be a consideration.
And the planning scheme controls require a consideration of this document here. I'll go back to the start. This is and you refer to this in your statement, to be fair. This is the Development of Wind Energy Facilities in Victoria Policy and Planning Guidelines, November 2021. Yes?
Yeah, yes, that's right.
And we all have to have regard to it. And now I'm just going to scroll back down to section 5 because you refer to section 5 in your statement, do you not?
I'll have to check. Could you tell me what paragraph it was that I referred it to?
Yeah, I think it's 56.
Paragraph 56.
Yeah. So you discussed these matters starting from paragraphs 54 of your statement, do you not?
Yes.
And in paragraph 56, you start off by saying you disagree with SONUS. Then you say the PPGWEF, which I assume is, it is in paragraph 53, it's the Policy and Planning Guidelines for the Development of Wind Energy Facilities in Victoria, refers to limits suggested in the New Zealand standard, and there's an objective assessment of high amenity noise areas in section 5 for areas where low background sound levels are common. So when you say section 5 there, you're referring to section 5 of this document.
No, I'm not. I'm referring to section 5 of the New Zealand standard.
I see. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. So but you agreed with us earlier that this document, the planning policy and the policy and planning guidelines, are relevant to the assessment of the planning merits of this wind farm application on a whole range of matters, including noise, yes?
Within the limits of the document itself. In other words,
Sure.
The document has, an application, and at the very beginning of the document, it says it's effectively saying that it's not a prescriptive document that should always be used.
I'd agree with that, but it's a decision guideline under the planning control, isn't it? It's something to which regard must be had in deciding the planning merits of this permit application, is it not?
Yes, it should be considered, definitely.
Yeah, and so what Mr. Turnbull and SONUS have done is they've come to section 5.1.2 of this guideline, which is referred to in the planning scheme, and they've looked at this paragraph in yellow highlight. Can you see this?
Yes.
And it says under section 5.3 of the standard, a high amenity limit of 35 decibels may be justified in special circumstances. We went to that a moment ago.
Yes.
All wind energy facility applications must be assessed using section 5.3 of the standard to determine whether a high amenity noise limit is justified for specific locations. Following procedures outlined in section 5.3 of the point 1 of the standard. Now, let's pause there. 5.3.1 of the standard, that's this, isn't it?
Yes, that's it.
It's not this.
That's explanatory.
Yeah, that's right. It's an explanatory guidance, but it's not a mandatory requirement of the standard, is it?
Well, this is where you get into normative and informative sections of the standard and comments. So normative, one would expect, is not the part where you've got the section starting with a C, which is a comment, but it gives you some background as to where the standard is coming from.
Yeah, fair enough. But you agree with me that when the wind farm, I'll call them the wind farm guidelines, the policy and planning guidelines, they refer to section 5. You agree with me that they refer to section 5.3.1 of the standard, not C 5.3.1, yes?
Well, it depends what the intent was. I mean, if they're referring to section 531, I don't know if they meant including comment or not including comment. I mean, it's something that I don't know.
Fair enough. Are you familiar with what earlier versions of these guidelines used to say?
Earlier versions, as in the 1998 version?
No,
or
the
guidelines
earlier versions of this guideline, sorry. My question might not have been clear.
Well, I have read them, but I can't recall which particular version that you're referring to.
No, that's fine. Doesn't matter. And I'll go back, excuse me, zipping through to the relevant paragraph. It then says guidance can be found on this issue in the VCAT determination for the Cherry Tree Wind Farm. So what the author of this planning guideline is saying, that if you want guidance on how to apply section 5.3.1 of the New Zealand Standard, you've got to go and read that case to see what it says about that task. That's exactly what it's saying, is it not?
Yes, it's exactly as it says. Guidance can be found on the issue. Yes.
Yeah, and Mr. Turnbull's had regard to that guidance, has he not? In reading that decision and saying, well, it's a farming zone around here. Cherry Tree says don't apply a high amenity amount to the farming zone, so I won't. That's effectively what he's done, right?
That's effectively what he's done. Yes.
And it's entirely consistent with what this paragraph requires acoustic consultants and planners to do, right?
It's not, well, it's consistent in some respects, but it's not all encompassing. So, for example, if there's other VCAT determinations that have been made since the Cherry Tree Wind Farm decision, then one would expect that you could also consider those.
And the example that you referred to was the Narrogate decision in your PowerPoint slides, which has some commentary, and we refer to them in our submissions as well, that case in our submissions, by the way, as well. But that decision was in 2019, was it not?
Yes.
Yes. And these guidelines were updated in November 2021, weren't they?
Yes, they were.
Yeah, so it's reasonable for us to infer, is it not? There's two inferences one could draw from that. One is that the author of these guidelines was not aware of the Narrogate decision. That's a possibility, isn't it?
It's a possibility, yes.
It's not likely though, is it?
I don't know. You'd have to ask the author, really.
Yeah, okay. All right. And the other possibility is that they read the Narrogate decision and thought, no, we think that analysis is defective. We think Cherry Tree is right. That's the other possible interpretation of this, isn't it?
That's your interpretation.
Well, it's a possible interpretation, surely.
Yes, of many. That's right. Yes.
because if they're aware of Narrogate and they thought Narrogate was right and Cherry Tree was wrong, then they'd refer to Narrogate Wind Farm decision in this at the end of this paragraph, wouldn't they?
Well, again, you have to ask the author as to his meaning behind it. I mean, he may not be aware of the Narrogate decision. I don't know.
Yep. Okay, let's go back to the New Zealand Standard. Now, throughout your statement, you referred to your view that the wind farm noise level should be 35 decibels instead of 40. Now, I assume what you're doing when you're referring to 35 decibels, and this isn't a criticism, but I'm assuming you're referring to, in shorthand, to the 35 decibel levels established under clause 5.3.3 of the New Zealand Standard. Is that what we should be assuming when we read that in your statement?
Yes, where it says in that section, it is recommended that the wind farm noise limits should be set lower than 35 dB at any time. So it could be lower than 35. Okay.
But what 5.3.3 says is that where a high amenity noise limit is shown to be justified in accordance with 5.3.1, which is that paragraph I took you to a moment ago, under wind conditions determined in accordance with 5.3.2, wind farm sound levels during evening and night should not exceed the background sound level of more than 5 dB or 35, whichever is the greater. So it's not just a flat 35 decibels at all times during the day, during the night, under all wind conditions. That's not what's contemplated by this clause, is it?
No, the clause contemplates a baseline of 35 dB or the baseline plus background, whatever that may be.
Yes, but in the circumstances set out in clause 5, provided it's justified under clause 5.3.1 and in wind conditions determined in accordance with 5.3.2. In other words, low wind conditions. Yes?
Well, low wind conditions locally to the dwelling, that's correct.
Yeah, so it's not, to just go back to my original question, when you refer to 35 decibels in your statement, it's 35 decibels established under this clause that we have in front of us on our screen, yes?
Oh, it's not that particular clause, it's the objective, but yes, it's in accordance with that generally. All
right, okay, so let's have a look at clause 5.3.1. Now, you haven't had regard to in your witness statement EPA guidance on the application or use of this clause, have you? Are you aware of that EPA guidance?
No, not particularly.
Okay. Is that because you didn't ask the EPA?
I didn't ask the EPA.
Okay. Let me just stop sharing and I want to show you something. Okay. Did you search the EPA website in preparing your statement for this proceeding?
No, I didn't.
I assume your view is that the Victorian EPA's views on this topic are irrelevant for deciding how to assess wind farm noise. Yes?
Not necessarily, no. It's I understand that legislation in Victoria is now firmly on the side of using the New Zealand standard as the guidance document.
That's right. And that's
that,
EPA legislation, is it not?
Yes, but any interpretation of those guidelines from the EPA could be valuable, but I haven't seen any document that actually explains how to impart the New Zealand standard particularly.
Well, you've read Mr. Evans' witness statement, and I take it?
Yes, I have.
And you've read Mr. Evans' PowerPoint presentation, I assume?
No, I haven't.
All right. Well, in Mr. Evans' PowerPoint presentation and in his statement, can you see my screen? Am I sharing my screen here? You can see a document. Now, this date isn't the date of the document. It's just the date that I downloaded it. But it's headed Wind Energy Facility Turbine Noise Regulation Guidelines, Victorian EPA.
Yes, and it says that in the disclaimer, the information in this publication is for general guidance only. It does not constitute legal or other professional advice.
That's right. That's right. That's absolutely right. But my question earlier is that any guidance published by the EPA Victoria in the assessment of noise effects of this project are a relevant consideration, surely. Yes?
Well, they could be considered, yes.
I mean, it's the peak waste management and pollution and noise authority in the state. Surely the inquiry and anyone giving evidence to the inquiry should be familiar with it, yes?
Yes, having regard to it says and should not be relied on as a statement of the law. So,
I'm not asserting that it is a statement of the law, but this isn't a guideline that you've had any regard to because you weren't aware of it until now.
I was aware that one was available because it was made apparent to me in the conclave that we had.
Okay, but you, just out of curiosity, you didn't get on the website and see if you could find it after the conclave?
Well, it was after my statement.
Yeah, okay. whatever. So let's go to page 6 of the guidelines. And you see the heading before you, application of high amenity area noise limit.
Yes.
And it says the 40 dBA base wind turbine noise limit is appropriate at most sensitive noise locations. Now that's not quite, but it's almost a verbatim quote from clause 5.2 of the New Zealand standard, isn't it?
Yes, generally. Yeah.
Yeah, generally, not exactly. But in New Zealand, the high amenity area limit described in the 2010 standard is only considered in specific areas requiring a higher degree of protection of amenity related to the sound environment of a particular area where these are identified within a district plan. And then it goes on to say in Victoria, the high amenity area limit is only intended to apply in the following circumstances. And do you see the dot points listed there? And
yes, I do.
Yes, and the first one is the high amenity area limit should apply to a dwelling located in the following zones predominantly intended for residential development. And there's a low density residential zone. There's none of those in the vicinity of this site, are there? The Willatook site, I mean.
I don't know about the Orford area.
No, so Orford has a township zone. So of those zones in the first dot point, it's the township zone that's the nearest of those zones to the Willatook project site. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. And it also says it should not be applied to the farming zone.
That's exactly right. That's what I was going to take you to. So as far as the EPA authors of this guideline are concerned, is that the high amenity area limit shouldn't be applied to the farming zone, but should be considered in what I'll loosely call the residential zones listed in the first dot point there, yes?
Well, can I ask, you took me to the date of this document. Was that 2019?
It's a download document that would have been published after the commencement of amendments to the Environment Protection Act in the middle of last year.
Right, so it is actually following the Narrogid
That's
VCAT
right.
decision, isn't it?
Yeah, all of this follows the noise protocol, these guidelines, the 2021 amendments to the 2017 Environment Protection Act, EPA Publication 18T6, 1996, they all follow Narrogid. Right?
Okay, so my question would be, have the authors of this particular regulation guideline, were they aware of the Narrogid decision?
They may or may not be, or they might have decided that Narrogid's a lot of rubbish, mightn't they?
Well, this is it. You have to ask the EPA, I suppose.
Yeah, but on the wording of these guidelines, let's just settle on what the document says. What the document says is that it shouldn't be applied to the farming zone, and that's consistent with what the tribunal said in Cherry Tree, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And so what Sonus and Mr. Evans have done is essentially applied the guidance set out in the wind farm guidelines referred to in the planning scheme and the guidance published by the Victorian EPA in these guidelines, have they not?
Yes, they've done it verbatim.
And the planning scheme isn't telling us, is it, to ignore DELT guidelines and the wind farm guidelines, or to ignore EPA guidance in publications such as this, is it?
No, but each of the guidelines are explanatory in terms of they are just guidelines. They're not obligatory.
But you've ignored, no, I withdraw that. You haven't ignored it, but you are not familiar with these guidelines until a moment ago.
No, not that particular one you've got on the screen.
Yeah, fair enough. So if I keep going down the dot points, it says it should not be applied in any location where background sound levels are already affected by other specific sources, such as road traffic noise. That's a sensible guideline for the EPA to publish, isn't it?
Well, yes, effectively, perhaps what that might mean is that the background noise levels taken, if they're influenced by road traffic noise, may not be appropriate.
Yeah. And then they say the high amenity area only applies for wind energy facility wind speeds up to and including 6 meters a second. Now that's just picking up the language used in clause 5.3.2 of the New Zealand standard, isn't it?
Yeah, now this is where they've got it wrong, big time.
Yep. I'll explain.
They really have misunderstood that. So the New Zealand standard if you go back to it, wherever
Yeah,
you might want to see it.
should I be going to taking you to 5.3.2? Can you see that? Or should I take you somewhere else?
Yeah, that's right. So the 6 meters per second thing comes in the comment section. So as you,
Is that C 5.3.2?
yes, that's right. That's a comment, isn't it?
It's a comment.
So
it's not part of the standard, but keep going.
That's right. So it not being part of the standard, so it's not mandatory that you should only have wind speeds of 6 meters per second and lower. But what it does explain is that in their estimation, that wind speeds of 6 meters per second and lower would generally coincide with periods of the lowest background sound levels at the noise sensitive locations.
Yeah.
Now, what's critical about this is that that's a guess. Now, if you take actual measurements, so for example, if you look at D37 in the background noise measurements that were taken by Sonus that I've reproduced in my presentation,
yep,
you can see that the background noise levels remain incredibly low, all the way up to 25 meters per second at the wind speed on the wind farm. So it's clearly inappropriate to use that. There we are. So
is this the one you're meaning to refer to? I wanted to get it in front of us. So
yeah,
when you're giving your evidence. Yep.
So that suggestion of 6 meters per second is probably the wind speed at the wind farm that gives you the lowest background noise levels is incorrect for this location, for example. So if you say 6 meters per second, then the background noise level is just over 30 dB. But if you go up to 20 to 25 meters per second, you can see it's of a similar level, 31, 32 dB. So clearly that comment, or rather guess, of 6 meters per second at the wind farm isn't appropriate.
There's quite a... Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry, please finish the question.
All I'm saying is that that 6 meters per second is fundamentally wrong in its assumption for this particular location.
But there's quite a scatter, isn't there, of sound levels above around 6. I'll say around 6, both above and below that progression curve, isn't there?
It's about +5 or -3, roughly. Yet at higher wind speeds, it's only about plus or minus 1.5 dB.
So have you prepared this using second or third order polynomials?
That one was just well, the first thing is I'm not referring to the trend line through here. I'm referring to the actual data points.
Yep.
But
okay,
as you can see on the trend line above, it was a second order polynomial.
Yeah, okay. All right. I'll stop sharing while I go back to the documents.
Mr. Power, just an appropriate point of questioning. If we just note we're scheduled for a break around this time.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm still going, sir.
Sorry?
I'm still going, sir. So if I can keep going after lunch, that'd be appreciated.
Okay, sure. As sometimes you may have a line of questioning you wish to end at. So
no, this is a good time to stop.
All right, thank you. And what we'll do is we'll take a break now and reconvene at 1:30 p.m.
Thank you.
And Mr. Houston, just note you're in the, partway through cross-examination, so you can't communicate with your client or anybody else about this matter.
Yes, understood.
Thank you. We'll see everyone at 1:30.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome back.
Hello.
Just continuing on questions from Mr. Powell on behalf of the proponent to Mr. Houston. I'll just check. Just check Mr. Feather is there.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. All right, continue on, Mr. Powell. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Houston. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Okay. Now, before lunch, I was asking you a question about your slide. This is the background analysis at D37. Can you see that on your screen?
Yes, I can.
And you've drawn the inquirer's attention to the regression curve, but also I think the background noise level data points at high wind speed, at higher wind speeds. But would the inquiry be right to understand that the typical practice and recommended practice for compliance purposes is to only focus on noise levels between the cut-in speed of the turbines and when they reach their maximum sound output, if I can put it that, which for the Vestas 12 for the Vestas we're looking at here is 12 meters a second. Would that be the inquiry be correct to understand that?
No, they wouldn't. The requirement in the standard is to cover all of the wind speeds that the wind turbines are capable of, which is from cut in to cut out. So what a number of consultants...
Sorry, that's actually what I meant. But keep going, but that's actually what I meant. Keep going.
Okay, well, cut out is about 25 meters per second, but the point at which it reaches maximum power might be 12 meters per second.
Okay, so I'm reading from the court's judgment in UREN, and on paragraph 171, and Her Honour said that she accepted the New Zealand standard, allowed the exclusion of data at wind speeds below the turbine's cut-in speed and above their rated wind speed. So the rated wind speed isn't the cutout. That's not the 25 meters a second, is it? So that's inconsistent with the answer you just gave, right?
No, it is very consistent. What was explained in that those proceedings was that the rated wind speed is actually the up to cutout, and it was explained extensively that it's difficult to get from the New Zealand standard, but if you follow it methodically, eventually you come to the conclusion that when they refer to rated wind speed, they're talking about the full rating of wind speed cut in to cut out, not just...
So the New Zealand standard says that, you're saying?
Well, bear in mind that the New Zealand standard in the UREN case was the 1998 version.
I mean the 2010 standard, sorry. So the 2010 standard, which we're looking at here, that doesn't equate the rated power to the cutout for the turbines, does it?
Well, I'm unsure, to be honest. Can you point me to a point in the standard?
I'm asking you whether you know.
Well, I don't think
New Zealand standard.
I mean, my impression of the New Zealand standard and understanding of the New Zealand standard 2010 is that it encompasses all of the operating potential of the wind farm, and the potential of the wind farm can operate up to cut out.
Okay. Can I go back to this topic of high amenity limits? Now, I was asking you some questions about the EPA guidelines, but in paragraph 61 of your witness statement, you comment on, and if I don't know whether you have it in front of you, it might help if you did, but you refer to the fact that the result of background measurements, that's the SONUS background measurements I assume you're referring to there, over many weeks in the area that are presented in the assessment, it's clear that background levels are consistently very low, and the objective assessment test of section C 5.3.1E would support the justification of a high amenity for these farming areas. I just want to be clear on your evidence here. I'll just go back to the standard and get it before us. Can you see C 5.3.1?
Yes, this is the comment section, which I think you were suggesting isn't part of the standard.
It's not a mandatory part of the standard, that's right.
Yeah, okay.
And in your paragraph 61, you're referring to this paragraph E, if the average difference in an evening or nighttime period prescribed time frame is greater than 8 decibels, then a high amenity noise limit is likely to be justified. That's what you're asserting that in paragraph 61 of your statement, aren't you?
Yes, that's right. The issue with that, however, is that it says likely to be justified. This is one of the woolly statements within the standard, unfortunately, that,
Sure.
you know, it might be 6 dB, it might be 10 dB.
Sure.
It's an estimate.
Yeah, but it's not apparent from your statement, isn't it, that, you know, C5.3.1 sets out a sequence of steps to calculate whether a place may or may not qualify for a high amenity noise limit. And you've not applied the steps in A, B, C, or D, have you, in your statement?
Well, my statement simply refers to that section E, which is the difference between nighttime background noise level and the predicted noise level.
Yeah, but for example, you've not undertaken the step in C, so calculating for each 10-minute time interval in the evening or nighttime prescribed timeframes, the arithmetic difference between the estimated post-installation sound level and the background sound level. You've not done that, have you?
No, I haven't.
No. And you've not estimated the post-installation sound level by an energy addition of the background sound level and predictive wind farm sound level, have you?
I haven't done a calculation of it because what I've referred to is the calculations from Sonus.
Yeah, but Sonus has only done these calculations for one dwelling, haven't they?
Sorry, they've done it for one what?
Dwelling, D11. Have you read Mr. Turnbull's reply statement?
Yes, yes, I have.
Yeah. So in Mr. Turnbull's reply statement, he includes calculations and describes what he's done under C5.3.1 for dwelling D11, hasn't he?
Well, if you can refer me to his that part of his statement, I can corroborate and confirm.
Sure. Give me a moment.
Trying to find if I've got a copy of it handy here.
That's it. Can you see, this is page 4, second expert witness statement of Christopher Paul Turnbull. Is that on your screen, Mr. Hewson?
Yes, it is.
And on the preceding page, at the bottom of page 3, you see he says, although I do not consider it necessary, I've conducted a further assessment for dwelling D11 in the farming zone, which has the highest predicted noise level. The assessment's been conducted in accordance with the objective procedure in C5.3.1 of the New Zealand Standard. And he's quoted the C5.3.1 below on page 4. Do you see that?
Yes, I see. I'm sorry, I mistook what you were referring to. This is his second expert statement, not his original one.
Correct.
Right.
That's exactly right. Sorry. And what Mr. Turnbull has concluded by undertaking that analysis for D11 is that under both the Konkawi and ISI modelling in the evening and night, the difference, the average difference derived under C5.3.1e is less than 8 decibels. Do you see that?
Yes, I can see what he's calculated.
Yes, so he's actually done the calculations for a dwelling in accordance with C5.3.1, but as you've just agreed with me, you haven't done the same type of calculations at all, have you?
No, I haven't. Can you confirm if he used 6 meters per second as a wind speed for that calculation?
Well, he would have to have used I don't know the answer to that question, but he must have done it at a low wind speed for the purpose of satisfying C5.3.1, wouldn't he? What do you think he should have done?
He should have used the maximum sound power output rather than the one that might have been relevant at 6 meters per second. I've seen previous work from Mr. Turnbull where he's done a prediction to do this sort of assessment.
Yep.
And he's used a reference to the comment in that section 531 where the presumption of a 6 meters per second wind speed would be appropriate for testing the condition.
But that is an appropriate presumption, isn't it?
No, it isn't.
Well, it's an appropriate presumption, isn't it? Because of clause 5.3.2 of the New Zealand Standard.
Well, in that comment, no, it isn't, because what I've explained before is you've got to look at the real sound level average at high wind speeds. And if the wind speeds at higher than 6 meters per second are maintained low, then you're supposed to look at that difference rather than the difference at 6 meters per second.
Yeah, okay. So I know you don't like the 6 meters a second, but that's also the criteria that was set out in that EPA guideline, which I took you to earlier and you hadn't read, correct?
Yes, it effectively has almost carbon copied the comment section of the New Zealand Standard.
Well, another way it's codified. Another way of putting it is through its guideline, it's codified it.
I don't think it's called codified if you've got a huge disclaimer at the beginning of the document saying that it shouldn't be relied upon.
Now, with the tribunal, would the inquiry be correct to understand that you gave expert evidence at the Delbourne Wind Farm inquiry panel?
Yes, I did.
And you put similar arguments to that panel about the suitability of applying a high amenity limit and the farming zone for that project?
Not similar, but not identical.
Yes.
I didn't refer to the Nargo, the Narrogid decision.
Okay. And have you given evidence on this in other planning panel inquiries recommending a high amenity limit?
Only that it should be considered.
Okay. All right. And it'd be right, isn't it, to have you read the Delbourne panel report?
Yes, when it was delivered. That was some time ago.
Yes. And the Delbourne panel recommendation did not recommend the application of a high amenity limit in the farming zone, did it?
From recollection, it didn't, no. But I think it did recommend that consideration of the high amenity zone should still be considered. Isn't that what happened in the conditions?
In the residential zones, consistent with the EPA guidance, correct. And have you read the Golden Plains panel inquiry report?
Yes, I have.
And Golden Plains also declined to apply a high amenity limit to the farming zone, didn't it?
Yes, that's right, they did.
Yeah. Unlike
the Narrogid. So I suppose you can pick a panel decision, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. Let's have a discussion about noise predictions. Now, you haven't undertaken your own noise predictions for this project, have you?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Now, in your witness statement, I think starting from paragraph 87, between 87 and 118, you make a number of criticisms of the noise predictions undertaken by SONUS, and I just want to explore some of those criticisms with you, if I may. Firstly, if I can start with paragraph 98, I just want to make sure you and I are on the same page here. You say it's generally accepted that ISO 9613 is a poor model for predicting wind farm sound levels, and it requires a number of adjustments. Just so I'm clear, I take it your evidence is that ISO 9613 is, if I can reverse it, is a reliable model if appropriate adjustments are made to the model. Is that what you
yes.
say? Yeah.
It can produce reasonable approximations, that's right.
That's right. And I think it's your evidence, isn't it, that you would prefer for planning permit issues for this project to mandate the use of ISO 9613?
Yes, with some specific inputs.
With specific inputs, and I'll ask you about that. But ISO 9613 is a standard that's widely used and accepted by planning regulators and environmental regulators throughout Australia, is it not?
Yes, it is, and its application for wind farms is also applied, especially in the Australian standards, for instance. They do as well.
The Australian standards, it's applied in Queensland and South Australia, Victoria.
Yes, that's right.
All right. Now, in respect of sound power levels, you expressed some concerns about the sound power levels, I think, but paragraphs 92 and 94, but also 99 and 102 of your statement. Now, just got a couple of things I want to understand here. Just give me a moment. Now, I guess as a starting point, Mr. Hewson, it's appropriate at the planning assessment stage for the acoustic consultant to undertake predictions of a candidate turbine that's either the preferred turbine or it's on the short list of turbines that might be considered for the project rather than an old turbine. That's common sense, isn't it? You would agree with me on that?
Yes, that's common sense.
Yeah, and Vestas has a number of wind turbines, does it not?
Yes, it does.
And it's the case, isn't it, that wind turbine technology is, well, it certainly appears to be, changing quite rapidly, yes?
They're getting bigger, certainly.
They're getting bigger and their energy output is increasing. Seems to be a correlation between the two, but I'm not an expert, but it's true isn't it, that turbine technology has changed a lot since you started giving planning evidence at inquiries for wind farms, hasn't it?
Yes, so the larger the rotor, the larger amount of energy you can extract from the wind. So obviously the power output increases with the larger rotor size.
And it can also take, history tells us that it can be a number of years can elapse between when a developer applies for planning permission or when planning permission is granted and when the development is actually, when the project's actually developed. That's the case also, isn't it?
Absolutely. I've seen situations of over, almost 10 years or so.
Yeah, there's a few examples of that. So it's appropriate, isn't it, to use a new or current turbine that's on the market now?
One would expect that would be an appropriate thing. You wouldn't guess what's coming. You'd use something that's available now as a benchmark.
Yeah. Now, you express a view in your statement that the sound power levels should accord with IEC 61400.
Yes, test results.
And test results, thank you. Now, I'm going to try and share my screen again. Can you see clause 6.2 sound power levels in the New Zealand standard in front of you?
Yes.
And the first sentence says the sound power levels of a wind turbine used for predicting sound levels should be obtained from the wind turbine manufacturer. And for the purposes of this standard, it's recommended. It's a recommendation, isn't it? It's not mandated. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, in the same way as the 40 dB base limit is recommended,
that's right.
I suppose. Yeah,
that's right.
That's right.
Be based on the apparent sound power and tonality values for the nominated wind turbine model, determined in accordance with the IEC. And that's where you pick up your views about the desirability of having measurements, tests carried out in accordance with that standard. But
yes, the application of the standard is really their independent test results. So you wouldn't, for example, refer to test results done by the manufacturer in accordance with the standard. They have to be independently verified. Yeah,
but we've got a dilemma, haven't we? Because on the one hand, we've got a turbine that's on the market that if it's approved, we're interested in using. But on the other hand, we don't have an IEC report for it, right? So, but that's not a problem, is it? Because the first sentence says that the sound power levels of a wind turbine used for predicting should be obtained from the wind turbine manufacturer. And that's happened for Willatook, hasn't it? Vestas has given sound power levels to Sonus, yes?
Yes, they have. And the issue, though, I think you mentioned that you should use currently available turbines. This 6 megawatt wind turbine doesn't seem to be available when I checked on the Vestas website.
Well,
they're not selling it.
Can I show you something?
Yes, certainly. Well, what seemed to be available on the website at the time were the higher capacities of the same V162.
Now, do you see a report prepared by Herring Storer Acoustics for a hydrogen plant in Western Australia?
Well,
On the
yes,
screen?
I can see it. Yes,
And you're
I've never
wondering
seen
why on earth am I taking you to this? I'll show you in a moment.
Good.
Do you see performance specifications for the V162 6 megawatt?
Yes, they're specifications. It's not an independent test result.
Now, I know that, but the standard, remember, the first sentence of 621 doesn't require that, does it? It just requires sound power levels to be used in modelling for modelling purposes, doesn't it?
Yes, my
Yes.
interpretation though is that when it refers to IEC 61400, you know, part 11, that is an independent test result rather than a manufacturer's specification
Yes,
result.
but that's, you agreed with me though earlier that that's a recommendation, not a requirement of the standard, correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And just for completeness, you see in this document, there's various sound modes for this turbine, and P06000 with a maximum sound power level of 104.3, available at various hub heights, including 169. That's what's been, 169 is what's been modelled by Sonus, has it not?
Yes, and hopefully there will be octave band data as well. Which, are you showing me that? Yes, there you are. Octave band and third octave band and wind speed data.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, bear in mind that this turbine isn't available now, so they should be referring to test results from those that are available from.
But if there aren't test results, Mr. Hewson, what do? Do we hang around and wait, or can we undertake an assessment based upon the information that's provided by the turbine generator as permitted under the first sentence of clause 6.2.1 of the New Zealand Standard? We can do that, can't we?
Well, you can do, but my proposition is that if they're not selling it, then you shouldn't really be using this one.
Well, I think we're using it because they're interested in selling it to us. They're presumably interested in selling it to this developer as well, yes?
Well, I suppose that they could revert to an older design, yes.
Yeah, they could revert to an older design that we're not going to use because it's old. That's effectively what you're asking us to do, right? Is trawl around the drawing board and find an old turbine that happens to have IEC testing for the purpose of getting planning permission. That's what you're suggesting, isn't it?
Now, what I'm suggesting is that if a manufacturer wants to promote its turbines, it should provide independent test results in accordance with that IEC standard. Rather than, I mean, these noise levels, for example, they're expected third octave band performance. If you see at the bottom, table 1, expected third octave band performance. They're not measured. These are hoped for values.
I won't take you through it now, Mr. Chairman. I'll table this document. It's public. That's why I've referred to it. But the information on this table, part 3.1, is actually identical to the equivalent table in the Sonus report. But I'll table it and you can check that for yourself, sir. All right, I'll stop sharing. While we're discussing sound power levels, if you give me a moment, in your statement, you referred to a Sloth 2004, in particular, paragraph 101 of your statement. Do you have that handy?
Yes, I do.
And you quote the Sloth study. Now, Sloth 2004, is that the PowerPoint presentation that's appended to your statement?
Yes, it is. And Sloth was one of the authors of the what's commonly called the Dual 3 work that was done in the UK. Yeah.
And if I go to the overview, it talks about noise measurements in accordance with IEC 61400-11:2002. Now, Tell me about this IEC standard. What can you tell me about it?
Well, it's a standard that tries to measure the power output of a wind turbine under different wind speeds. It's done under a condition where you minimize the inflow wind turbulence.
Yep.
It's done for a single turbine.
Yep.
It's done at a measurement location that's 1.5 times the hub height away. Well, it's not 1.5 times. It's hub height plus the rotor radius distance away is where the measurement's taken, and
Yep.
it's measured downwind.
Okay.
Anything else you need to know?
No, that's helpful. And in sloth, on the next page, noise measurements IEC 61400-11 2002, and he keeps referring to that version of the IEC, but the standard. But the inquiry would be right to understand, wouldn't it, that the IEC 61400-11 has been reissued and updated since that sloth paper was written. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, in two respects, basically. It's updated the prediction should be referenced to hub height rather than, well, so the measurements are taken, referred back to hub height, and then they're standardized down to 10 meters high.
Yeah. So it was no, you keep going. That's fine. I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's one difference. And the other difference is the determination of wind speed. The old standard had an anemometer separate to the wind turbine, and the anemometer from that provided the wind speed data. What the latest standard does is determine the wind speed from the power curve of the turbine until such time as it reaches a point where that becomes too uncertain, and then you can rely on the anemometers sitting on the top of the turbine.
Yeah, the problem is, the problem we've got, isn't it, is that the sloth paper that you're referring to in your statement expresses opinions about an outdated version of IEC 61400-11. That's the problem, isn't it? We don't know what sloth thinks about the current standard. Yes?
No, I don't think that's right. The thrust of Sloth's presentation is that the IEC standard is a test for an idealized single wind turbine that doesn't account for inflow turbulence, for example, and doesn't account for site effects.
Yep.
Now, the latest standards don't consider those things either. So what he said in 2004 is still relevant.
Well, you say, but we don't know what he says, right?
I believe that they are still relevant. Let's put it that way.
You believe. All right.
I believe.
Okay. Okay. Let's talk about sound ground absorption values. So your evidence, sometimes, I'm not an acoustician, Mr. Hewson, so I sometimes get my G equals 0 and G equals 1 mixed up, but G equals 0 is basically hard ground. Is that right? And G equals 1 is absorptive ground. Is that, or have I mixed them up?
No, that's the right way of considering it. So G equals 0 is a reflective surface, and G equals 1 is a fully absorbent surface.
Yeah, okay. And the definitions of G equals 0 and G equals 1 are set out in ISO 9613.
Yes, they are.
Now,
and they're also so ISO 9613 has certain classifications for what it considers G should be, but you have to bear in mind that the 9613 is relevant for source heights up to 60 meters. And so you have to, take it with a pinch of salt as to how relevant those values are.
Yeah, so that goes back to the point that we were discussing earlier, that you need to make adjustments in order to have reliable predictions from ISO 9613. Is that the point you're making?
Well, it's one of the points, yes.
Yeah, okay.
There are other points that you have to consider.
All right. So Mr. Turnbull explained, and I've got the standard in front of me, that G equals 0 includes paving, water, ice, concrete, and other ground surfaces having a low porosity. So that's sounding, to me, that's sounding like a Bunnings car park or a iced over lake. That's right, isn't it?
No, it also consists of packed hard ground. So
Tamped ground. Yeah.
Well, let's say if you've got a waterlogged ground like you might have at the moment with the past rains, then that's a fully reflective surface. If you have a hard packed ground such as you might have in drought conditions, then you could also have hard ground.
So I've just put it up on the screen. Is that the relevant standard 9613-2 1996E?
Yes, that's right.
Describes hard ground. So it includes paving, water, ice, concrete, and other ground surfaces having a low porosity.
That's right.
And G = 1 is ground covered by grass, trees, or other vegetation. You would hardly say, can I ask my question first, and then you can answer it. So you would hardly. Have you been to Willatook?
Yes, I've been around the area.
Yeah, you've been around the area. So you would have observed blue gum plantations. You would have observed agricultural properties in the area. Orford is not a busy metropolis, is it? It's more like a small locality or a settlement. That's a fair description, isn't it?
Yes, it's not a busy metropolis, that's for sure.
No, and you wouldn't describe the agricultural landscapes around Willatook and Orford as meeting the description of hard ground as set out in the standard in front of us, would you?
Yes, it can be, depending on the time of year and the conditions.
Well, we're not going to have ice there, are we? And we're not going to have paving, are we?
But you can have sodden ground, and you can have drought conditions hard ground. So those things can apply. Yes,
okay. But if there are more reflective surface or less absorptive surfaces during a drought or when it's wet, do you don't necessarily just switch from G = 1 to G = 0, do you? Because there's this concept of mixed ground, yes?
Yes, you can have mixed ground, certainly.
Yeah. And mixed ground might include, during a drought, conditions where there are more reflective surfaces because the ground conditions are hard, but you have other features of the landscape. It's a fairly complex agricultural landscape, which would not meet the definition of hard ground, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. All right, now, in your witness statement, just got to get it in front of me, bear with me a moment. At paragraph 103, Mr. Hewson, you say that ENA, that's the environmental noise assessment. I'm referring to it as the SONUS assessment. It's used a value of G = 1 for Konkawi. And then you go on to say that the South Australian EPA requires wind farm noise models to use G = 0 if ISO 9613 or Konkawi are used. And you refer to the 2009 wind farm guidelines, which I think you acknowledged earlier have been replaced by the 2021 guidelines. But that sentence isn't correct, is it?
As far as I know, it is. I mean, when I look at the 2009 guideline, it says that for the purpose of a conservative model, you should use G = 0 when using ISO 9613 or Konkawi. Yeah,
but it doesn't just say that, does it? Let me just share it on the screen, and Now I'll go back to the start just so that you're clear on what we're looking at. These are EPA South Australia wind farms environmental noise guidelines. And I'll go to the next page. It's dated November 2021.
Yes, this is the updated version of the July 2009. The weird thing is that they've kept the same ISBN number.
Yeah. And in 3.3, there's a discussion around noise level predictions for development applications. And it starts by saying the noise level associated with the wind farm should be predicted at all locations identified as relevant receivers under the guidelines for wind speeds from cut-in speed to the speed of the rate of power for each integer speed in between. We were chatting about that a short while ago. Then on the next page, there's a discussion about propagation model, and you can see at the top of page 11 that there's a recommendation to utilise either 9613-2 or Konkawi. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then further down, you can see a conservative approach should be used for predicting wind farm noise by calculating noise level in octave bands to determine an overall predicted level and using the following outputs. And I assume that what you're referring to is the third dot point, hard ground, zero ground factor. So is that what you're referring to as the justification in these guidelines for using a G equals 0 factor input for the modelling purposes?
Yes, G equals 0 is what that means.
Yeah, so thank you. And presumably it means G equals 0 for either 9613 or Konkawi modelling. Is that how you read it? Yeah.
That's how I read it.
Okay. Now the next paragraph says noise propagation model and parameters as recommended in section 4.3 of the Institute of Acoustics, a good practice guide to the application of ETSU R97 for the assessment and rating of wind turbine noise, May 2013, may be utilised as an alternative to the above input parameters. So it's the case, isn't it, that you don't have to use the factors in those 3 dot points. You can also use section 4.3 of the UK Good Practice Guide, can't you?
Yes, in fact, that was a subject of the conversation I had with the author of this last week. And I referred to this section 4.3 of the Institute of Acoustics Good Practice Guide.
Yep.
And I explained that, that there are 2 recommendations in there. One is using G equals 0 with a receiver height of 1.5 meters. And the other one is their recommendation of using G equals 0.5 with a receiver height of 4 meters.
Yeah.
And we discussed the issue of a receiver height, and he agreed that it was inappropriate to use a receiver height of 4 meters because no one uses it in Australia. And at the end of the conversation, he suggested that perhaps he ought to clarify this in a further revision of this guideline.
Good on him. But for the purpose of the guideline that's in force at the moment, this fella that you spoke to, we don't know who he is or what his status is, but for
it's
the
on
moment,
the front page of the guideline. He's the author.
All right. But the guidelines refer to and state that it's acceptable to do wind farm sound assessments in accordance with section 4.3 of this IOA publication. Yes, that's what it says.
Yes, you can use other parameters, but you just have to bear in mind that the receiver height is 1.5 meters, not 4 meters.
So is this the document that's referred to? Is this the Institute of Acoustic Documents referred to in the South Australian EPA guidelines, the May 2013 Good Practice Guide?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, you've referred to this publication yourself, haven't you, in paragraph 106 of your statement?
Just let me check. Yes, I have.
And you've quoted it.
Yes, I've said that part of it says a ground factor of G equals 0 is commonly used as it will tend to provide robust predictions in most situations.
Yeah, and that's consistent with your view on the topic. So can you see on my screen section 4.3 starting at the bottom of page 19 over the page 20 of the Good Practice Guide? And take you to paragraph 4.3.2. It explains that the following applies to predictions for the assessment of onshore wind turbine noise. They're relevant to the application of the widely used ISO 9613-2 standard. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then in paragraph 4.3.4, it says a soft ground factor G equals 1.0 should not be used. Now, you obviously agree with that, and we don't question it either, by the way. And then if I go to paragraph 106 in the second sentence, this is your quote. although a ground factor of G equals 0 is commonly used, as it will tend to provide robust predictions in most pits, this can overpredict noise. No, I'm looking at the wrong paragraph, I beg your pardon. Although a ground factor of G equals 0 is commonly used, it will tend to provide robust predictions in most situations. You failed to include in your statement, this can overpredict noise levels. For consistency, it's recommended to use a ground factor of G equals 0.5. Now you've left out the second part of, and I'll put it to you, the key part of paragraph 3.5 from your statement, haven't you?
Well, I've left it out only because it can underpredict as well as overpredict. It's
the problem with paragraph 106, the second sentence of a paragraph 106, is that it leads the reader to think, does it not, that the UK Institute of Acoustics recommends a ground factor of G equals 0 because it provides robust predictions. That's what the reader infers from paragraph 106, surely.
Yes, basically the Institute of Acoustics recognise that G equals 0 is commonly used and it can provide robust predictions. Now, in terms of producing a robust prediction, it's better to err on a conservative side, which is why they're saying that, yes, it can overpredict noise levels.
But the problem is, Mr. Hewson, is with your statement. It goes on to say, G equals 0 can overpredict noise levels. For consistency, it is recommended to use a ground factor of G equals 0.5. Now, you've deliberately left and consciously left those words from this paragraph out of your statement, haven't you?
Well, I could have included the whole lot if you wish. I mean, it would still have the same relevance because where it says for consistency, it is recommended to use a ground factor of G equals 0.5. When you look further down the page on that document you have, it says that when using G equals 0.5, you're supposed to have a receiver height of 4 meters.
Are you saying?
Isn't...
Go ahead, please keep going.
And so it's a pairing of two conditions for the use of the ISO standard. G equals 0, you've got 1.5 meter receiver height, or 0.5 meters G equals 0.5 if you've got a 4 meter receiver height. So there's two pairs that you can look at.
All right, so let's just cut to the chase here. Do you think the inquiry would not have been assisted by having you, having referred to this publication, actually quote in full what that paragraph says rather than have you selectively quote it?
Well, the panel is fully informed now by seeing the whole document.
Well, they are, but they weren't informed by you, were they?
Well, my interpretation of this is that G equals 0 is a commonly used and a reasonable approach to use. And
can overpredict noise levels. That's what the UK Institute of Acoustics says, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, absolutely.
But really, the reader of your statement would have been clueless about that unless they went back to the source document, yes?
Well, they wouldn't have known about the other words unless they went to the source document, correct?
See, the problem I have with this is that you declared in your statement and at the outset of your oral evidence that no matters of significance, which I regard as relevant, have to my knowledge been withheld from the panel. But in fact, that's precisely what you've done here, isn't it?
No, I haven't withheld it from the panel at all.
Well, you haven't quoted it, have you?
No, I haven't quoted it, but there are other things I haven't quoted as well.
Is there anything else that you've selectively quoted in your statement that we should know about?
Well, I don't believe that I've selectively quoted it to mislead anyone. I believe that I've selectively quoted it to be representative.
Right. You and I are going to have to agree to disagree on that. I'll move on. Can we both agree, therefore, that it's evident from the paragraph 4.3.4 that the UK Institute of Acoustics recommends a ground factor of G equals 0.5 for the purpose of undertaking wind farm noise predictions using the ISO 9613 standard. That's what they say.
That's what they say, but only if you have a receiver height of 4 meters, and that's the key issue here.
Yeah. So SONUS used G equals 0.5 in its assessment, did it not?
Yes, with a receiver height of 4 meters.
All right. So let's have a look at this. So paragraph 4.3.8 says the adoption of a receiver height of 4 meters is recommended regardless of time of day, as it has the effect of reducing the potential oversensitivity of the calculation to the receiver region ground factor compared to lower receiver heights. Do you see that?
Yes.
And do you agree with that?
Well, yes, it depends what they mean by oversensitivity of the calculation, because the calculation is done in terms of 3 different sections for ground absorption. So you have the ground absorption near the source, then you've got a middle section, and then you've got a receiver section near the receiver, obviously.
So,
now,
go ahead. Sorry.
So the problem with wind farm noise is that the source height is so high that when you have 5 times the source height for the initial ground absorption section, it encompasses almost everything right up to the receiver. So there is no middle section. So you're trying to shoehorn some method into 9613 that isn't designed for wind farms. So this is an example of some of the manipulation that the Institute is suggesting that might give you better results. But if the receiver height is 4 meters and 4 meters isn't used in Australia, then perhaps that's the wrong part of the standard to refer to.
Well, Mr. Turnbull, in his statement or in his evidence to this inquiry, explained that 1.5 meters would result in a greater ground absorption of sound adjacent to the receiver than a 4 meter height. Now that stands to reason, doesn't it?
No.
And
no, it doesn't.
All right. And Mr. Evans actually said that if you used a 1.5 meter receiver as opposed to a 4 meter receiver, the ground absorption effects of a 1.5 meter receiver would result in I think it was an underprediction of several, I can't remember the exact number, but I think it may have been 2 decibels, might have been more actually. That's right, isn't it?
No, you can't convolute different parameters in this model. So if you have a G equals 0.5 and you have a receiver height of 4 meters, you'll get a result of X. If you have a G equals 0 with a receiver height of 1.5, then the predicted level will be 4 dB higher.
Yeah.
So
okay.
That's from really running through the model and applying these things. If you have, you can't mix and match the two. So you have to have G equals 0.5 with a 4 meter high, or G equals 0 with a receiver height of 1.5. And when
but that's not what this paragraph is saying, is it?
No, you see, in the UK, it's common to have 2-story dwellings, so 4 meter as a receiver height could be quite reasonable.
Okay. Can I now ask you some questions about special audible characteristics? Give me a moment. I just want to get the standard back up. And find the right part. There we go. I'll put it back up on the screen. It's probably easiest if we both have it in front of us, isn't it? Okay, can you see clause 5.4 of the New Zealand standard there, the 2010 standard?
Yeah. Yes, okay.
Okay. Now, do you agree with me that clause 5.4.1 there, wind farms shall be designed so that wind farm sound does not have special audible characteristics at noise-sensitive locations. That is essentially a prohibition on a wind farmer designing a wind farm that has special audible characteristics at noise-sensitive locations. Do you read it the same way as me?
I think what they're trying to do is to say that special audible characteristics are problematic and should be avoided.
I think they're saying more than that, aren't they? Because this standard often uses the word shall, but I think in the interpretation section of this standard, they say, well, shall is a mandatory requirement. So I hate the word shall personally. I like must, but the way I read this sentence is that that's not merely a discouragement, but that's a prohibition on designing a wind farm with special auditable characteristics. Now, might be a matter for legal submission, but if that was right, then presumably that's something you'd agree with. Yes.
Well, this is where I think you're being a bit selective of that paragraph, because when it goes on to say, however, as special auditable characteristics cannot always be predicted, consideration should be given to whether there are special auditable characteristics of the wind farm when comparing measured levels with noise limits. So what it's saying is that we acknowledge that you shouldn't have any, but in practice, you can't predict them. Therefore, when coming to measurements, we'll include a penalty for it.
Yeah, so that might be one way of interpreting it, but another way of interpreting it, I'd put it to you, is that clause 5.4.1 is saying is you can't design a wind farm with special auditable characteristics, but if your wind farm has special auditable characteristics, then you've got to go and fix it. But you can only have SACs if you've breached the first sentence. Yes.
Well, it's an interpretation.
All right, but it's fair. It's right to say, isn't it, that if a acoustic consultant had information about special auditable characteristics for a turbine for the purpose of carrying out noise predictions, the consultant or the expert should model and address those special auditable characteristics. Yes.
No, that isn't the way it works. The way it works is that the sound power generated from test results go into the model.
Yes.
And if the model predicts, let's say, I don't know, 36 dB for the sake of argument.
Yep.
If the test results indicate that there is likelihood of, let's say, tonality, which is a special auditable characteristic, then you apply a weighting on your predicted levels. So what then happens is that your predicted level of, let's say, 34 dB might be weighted with an extra 5 dB to account for special auditable characteristics that have been demonstrated in the test results.
So can I just recite to that to make sure it's clear in my head? You say that if a wind turbine manufacturer gives an acoustic expert such as yourself or Mr. Turnbull or Mr. Evans sound power level data, test results data that suggests that there's special auditable characteristics that are likely to be detectable at a noise sensitive location, you just apply a penalty. Is that how you read this? Is that how you apply it?
That's the way the New Zealand standard would be applied, yes.
All right. And paragraph 5.4.2 talks about applying the penalty that you've just referred to up to 6 decibels. 6 decibels, I read that as being a maximum. So it would be fair to say, wouldn't it, that perhaps the magnitude or the scale or effect of the special auditable characteristic influences your decision as to whether you applied a 6 dB penalty or a lower penalty. Would that be right?
Yes, that's right.
All right. Now, I've just got a question. There's something I wasn't... Actually, no, I think you have answered that. Bear with me a moment. In the joint witness statement, I won't take you to it, but you might recall it. You make a statement that effectively the treatment of special auditable characteristics in the SONUS report is, if you like, satisfactory, but you make reference to there being an interim test method. I just want to be clear what you mean by an interim test method. Do you mean an IEC test report, or do you mean something else?
Okay, so in the New Zealand standard, you've obviously got that in front of you. So if we
do you want me to get it up?
Oh, you've got it up in front of you.
Yep. Where would you like me to take us?
Appendix B.
Yep.
So Appendix B is a normative section dealing with special auditable characteristics.
Yes.
So that is where you apply an appropriate penalty, and penalties for tonality, for example, are described in that section, as are amplitude modulation. And the reference that you pointed me to when you refer to an interim test method,
yep,
is presumably you're referring to amplitude modulation.
Well, you refer to it just in the context of special audible characteristics. I wasn't clear. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah,
It's not a trick question. I'm trying to ask what you meant.
The only reference in the standard to interim test method is under amplitude modulation assessment.
Okay. Let me go on to the next page so you can point it out to us. So B 3.2, is that what you mean?
Correct.
Yeah. Just your evidence, I think, is you say in your statement, you refer to or recommend, paragraph 34, I do not recommend a condition that allows a subjective assessment of tonality. I just want to be clear, the New Zealand standard actually doesn't contemplate an objective assessment of tonality, does it? Or sorry, subjective assessment of tonality.
No, it doesn't. But
did you mean amplitude modulation?
No. Tonality, for example, or amplitude modulation, any of the SACs. We've had situations where consultants have prepared noise compliance test plans for wind farms,
yep,
and the noise compliance test plan stipulate that, oh, well, we'll just listen, and if our qualified acoustic consultants of their opinion decide that on a subjective assessment that there are no SACs applicable, then we won't proceed with the objective measurements. And that's common in numerous wind farms that have had endorsed noise compliance test plans. And my objection to that is that you shouldn't rely on a couple of random samples measured during the day to assess the implications of what's happening in the middle of the night on particular occasions throughout a 4-week monitoring survey. You shouldn't just have two subjective assessments from an acoustic consultant that when he put the equipment out, he just had a quick listen and thought, oh, that's all right. You really have to assess things objectively throughout the survey. Yeah,
I just want to be clear, I noted, but when looking at Appendix B of the New Zealand Standard, there is, if you like, I acknowledge this subjective aspect for assessing amplitude modulation under B 3.1, but as a layperson reading B2 for tonality, I read them both as being consisting of objective test methods, not subjective test methods for tonality. And I just want to make sure whether my reading was right or if it's wrong, if you can tell you where I've mucked up.
No, it's effectively what Appendix B does is set some objective test methods to assess SACs.
Yeah. And so a subjective assessment of SOCs with the possible exception of amplitude modulation, and I want to talk about objective tested amplitude modulation shortly, but is really only contemplated for amplitude modulation in Appendix B of the New Zealand Standard, yes?
Well, it's certainly contemplated in section B 3.1.
Yeah, correct. That's what I'm referring to, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, now, if we look at, I'll put it back up on the screen if it's easier for me to have it in front of everyone. Now, if we look at B 3.2, this is what's described as the interim test method. I take it that that's not a test method that you endorse.
No, it's a test method. It's a test method that is a normative section of the standard. Therefore, that test method should be applied. And the test method is quite clear. It says, if the A-weighted peak to trough levels exceed 5 dB on a regular varying basis of the measured third octave band peak to trough levels exceed 6 dB on a regular basis. That regular basis is referring to the regularity of blade swish going up and down.
Okay,
It's not,
I understand.
No.
And CB 3.2 explains that this method, I assume they mean the interim method referred to above, is considered to be an adequate interim test that has been used in New Zealand. It is envisaged that appropriate objective tests for modulation, special audible characteristics will be developed in future to replace B3.2. Now that Standards New Zealand, to my knowledge at least, hasn't done that as yet. Has that happened as yet to your knowledge?
No, the standard hasn't been updated to provide a modified test method. And as you mentioned, comments are not part of the standard, so to speak, but section B 3.2, that interim test method is a firm part of the standard. It's normative.
Now, just Mr. Turnbull, in his evidence, referred to another objective method for assessing amplitude modulation. And it was this document here. It's the Institute of Acoustics Amplitude Modulation Working Group Final Report, a method for rating amplitude modulation and wind turbine noise. He expressed a view that as an objective method for assessing amplitude modulation, that this was a desirable process or procedure. Now, first of all, are you familiar with this document?
Yes, I am.
And do you agree with Mr. Turnbull on that issue?
No, I don't.
So you prefer B3.2 to this method?
Well, this is a method that produces a value for a particular amplitude modulation.
Yeah.
Now, the value that's generated from this method is not the peak to trough level that's referred to in the New Zealand standard.
Right. So what's the value that's predicted here?
Well, the value from the interim test method is if the A-weighted peak to trough levels regularly exceed 5 dB, that's one test.
Yep.
The other test is if any third octave band level exceeds a peak to trough level of 6 dB,
yep,
then that triggers the penalty as well.
Yep.
The Institute of Acoustics does not apply that test method. The method that's described here is quite convoluted, but I can explain it to you if you wish. Fundamentally, what happens is that you take 10-second chunks of an audio recording.
Yep.
You split those 10-second chunks into analysis periods. And what you do with the analysis is you, first of all, detrend the data. By detrending the data, it means that you, if the average noise level, let's say, was 40 decibels and the peak to trough was varying about 40 decibels, detrending is taking it down 40 decibels so that the result is just the amplitude modulation and you don't see the 40 dB offset, if that is understandable.
I think I follow, but the acousticians in the room are more likely to follow perhaps. But no, okay, that's fine. But the point of you disagree with Mr. Turnbull about the suitability of this method. That's really what I'm trying to get to. That's
yes, and what I'm trying to explain is why I disagree. So that's the first step in detrending. What then happens is you do a Fourier transform or the power spectrum analysis, and you look at the first and second harmonics of the fundamental. You then reconstitute the time waveform, and then from that, you then look at what they call prominence within it.
Yep.
Then you set a limit on prominence. Then you go on to the next step. And at the end of the day, what eventually happens is that you look at the L95 level compared to the L5 level of every 10-second sample. You take the L95 from the L5, which gives you a value, which again underestimates the peak to trough level. You do that for all of the 10-second samples within any 10-minute period. And at the end of the 10-minute period, you take all of those measurements that have been done in terms of L5 minus L95, and then you do an L10 statistic of them, which further reduces the amplitude modulation. The end result is a value that is extremely, it way underestimates the true peak to trough value that is referenced in the New Zealand standard. Furthermore, what happens with this method is that it doesn't provide a penalty. It gives you a number from a calculation process. That number is then not applied to any penalty. So it's not graded in any way.
But there's subsequent publications that have recommended how to apply penalties to in the UK, aren't there, that have been tabled on these proceedings that recommend how to apply penalty to amplitude modulation. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, and they've been shot down in flames by a number of consultants in the UK. And
okay. Consultants like you?
Well, me and others. I mean, for instance, the author of ETSU R97 is also
okay. So can I ask you this? Because look, no one at Wind Prospect has a closed mind about appropriate compliance conditions. Now, evidence has been given by one acoustician recommending this. You obviously disagree. There's an objective method in B3.2. Is it your evidence that B3.2 is the appropriate objective method to be used for the purpose of assessing compliance with the and potentially penalising amplitude modulation in accordance with the standard?
Absolutely, yes. It should be used because New Zealand Standard 6808 is the reference standard to use, and there's a normative section within there which spells out what you should do. So from my view, you shouldn't be then, go searching around for other,
yep.
other methods.
Yeah, it contemplates being replaced, but I know what you say. Look, I'll move on. I just got some quick questions about infrasound and construction, and then I want to just, if I've got time, which I probably don't, ask you some questions about your slides in the document you tabled last night, to the extent that I'm across them. At paragraph 127 of your statement, or from 125, you discuss infrasound, and you disagree with the Sonus's comment at the end of 127 that they make regarding infrasound from wind turbines being comparable to the normal ambient environment. And then in paragraph 126, you explained that you took your own measurements, firstly, and they're described in a paper you published in 2015. And you say that you found the overall infrasound levels below 8 Hertz changed little for the turbines at MacArthur when the wind farm was completely shut down from maximum power generation in high winds to a standstill in the same winds due to a substation fault. So in other words, can I put it in my layperson's jargon and you can correct me? Am I understanding that your infrasound measurements basically didn't change between when the turbines were running and when they were off? At MacArthur Wind Farm.
Yeah, okay, I'll explain. The overall sound levels below 6, 7, or 8 Hertz changed by 3 decibels when the wind turbines should suddenly shut down. So the implication of that is that whether the wind farm is running or not at MacArthur, the low frequency infrasound section produces the same output.
Yeah.
So what it's saying is that when the wind is blowing strongly across non-operating turbines, it produces an infrasound signature of a certain value, X. When you turn them on, it goes up by 3 dB.
Okay.
So basically, the operating turbines are of a similar level to the non-operating when exposed to the same wind speed.
Yep. Is this a 2015 paper you're referring to in paragraph 126?
Yes, that's right.
And you say in your summary you've used macro barometers to quantify the infrasonic emissions. And further down, you've talked about instrumentation Acoustic professionals are familiar with the common microphone connected to sound level meters. Unfortunately, IEC 61672 is designed for the audible frequency range. And then you say an alternative to the microphone for infrasound measurement is a MEMS pressure transducer. And this type of device can be calibrated at static pressure and is used as a reference to calibrate infrasound equipment. You say in the next paragraph, the equipment used for the monitoring results reported in this paper was developed in-house. I just want to ask, is that code for saying that you made it, you developed it?
Yes, it was developed here, yes.
And
it was also
you developed it in your lab or something like that? Yep.
Yes, that's right. And then it was constructed elsewhere by some professional electronics people.
Yeah, and this paper nor your statement include any sort of calibration certificates or independent calibration certifications of those devices you use to measure infrasound in that paper, do they?
No, the paper doesn't contain those.
No. And that's a bit of an issue, isn't it? Because, you know, for Sonus, for its sound loggers, the sound loggers it used for its environmental noise assessment, it set out all the calibration certificates for its sound loggers, but we don't have an equivalent for the kit that you've made or designed, I think, to be fully correct, to measure infrasound at MacArthur or Cape Bridgewater wind farm. There's nothing like that, is there?
Well, just to explain what a calibration is. So you have a calibration certificate that certifies that it meets a particular standard. So, for example, for sound level meters, the standard is ISO 61672.
Yep.
So your calibration says, I've tested this meter and it matches the performance requirements stipulated in that standard. Now, there isn't a standard for infrasound instrumentation. So you can't calibrate it in terms of reference to a standard because there isn't a standard to calibrate it against.
Fair enough, but we're relying on you to tell us that the kit's working properly, aren't we?
Well, I've done my own tests of the calibration
Sure.
of the equipment, and
Sure.
From my calibrate, and I've also sent the test results through to the nuclear test ban treaty people, and they've corroborated that the results are representative.
Okay, but that's not referenced in your statement either, is it?
I don't think so. I can't remember if I did reference them.
Okay. Now, for construction noise, as I understand it, the main difference of opinion between you and Mr. Evans and Mr. Turnbull is that they have adopted for their preliminary construction assessment. It has to be a preliminary construction because they've just had to make assumptions, haven't they, about the type of equipment, the locations, and so on, for the purpose of doing their construction noise assessment. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, and so the main difference of opinion is they've used a 30 decibels background value for the purpose of evaluating compliance with EPA publication 1834 for evenings and nights, and you think that's too low, it should be 20. Is that the nub of the difference of opinion between you?
Well, it could be too low, it could be too high. My
Sure.
Opinion is that you should use the actual background measurements from particular properties, and that when you do, so effectively the different grades of assessment under the EPA, one is a free-for-all that you don't need a particular permit to do certain activities.
Yep.
And then it gets more and more stringent. And one of the more stringent requirements is that you actually have a construction plan that you have to meet and demonstrate that you meet certain targets. And my recommendation is that you have one of those plans for each premises. Okay.
So the nub of it is that background equals background whatever it is, and it should be measured to establish how you comply with 1834. Is that the nub of the point you're making? Okay.
Correct.
All right. Just check a couple of other things. I'm just going to get your slides up. And bear with me. want to ask you some questions about intermittent noise. Mr. Evans, in his evidence, took the inquiry to clause 7.4.1 of the New Zealand Standard in response to the concerns that you and your client have about relying upon the, I'm going to use the word, but acousticians don't like it, the averaging and the comparison of regression curves. Now, for background sound measurements and post-construction operational sound measurements. And what he was drawing the inquiry's attention to is that background sound level measurements should be plotted against the hub height wind speeds existing at the time of each measurement to obtain the scatter plot. You've got to examine this plot to determine whether a singular regression relationship is evident. If there are markedly different groups within the scatter plot, then separate scatter plots may be required for different conditions, including wind directions and times of day. So he was suggesting that if there are anomalous data points in your scatter plot, that in fact the standard isn't directing the acoustician to just ignore it and whack it into the regression curve, but to actually have a closer look and analysis of that. And he's right, isn't he? That's what 7.4.1 says. Yes?
Yes, 7.4 with regards to background measurements and the assessment of these trend lines through the data is very subjective and in the hands of the person doing the analysis.
Okay, so that's it's the question. It's not a failing in the standard. It's you say a potential failure of the person that's implementing the standard. Is that the nub of your concern here?
I'm not saying it's a failure of the person doing the analysis. What I'm saying is that standards are required generally to be given to one person, and then you give it to another person, and you should end up with the same result.
Yep.
That's the objective of standard. What happens with this is that you can give this standard to one person assessing background measurements, and they can produce one trend curve, and you can give it to another consultant or whoever, and they could produce a different trend curve.
Yep.
So this is one of the ambiguities of producing these trend line data. So for example, further down, it's allowable within the standard to do bin analysis rather than general trend analysis. Using the two analysis methods will give you totally different results. And I can refer you back to that D30. This is in my presentation. So
I'm just trying to find it where it is. Yep, I found it.
It's the night background D37. And if you look at the simple trend line that's been thrown in there,
keep going.
Keep going down. Yeah, keep going. That one. So if you look at that trend line, this is just a trend line thrown in through all the data as done by Excel spreadsheet. It just believes that that's right. Now, if I look at that data, I could say, hang on, that's not right at high wind speeds because the trend line is higher than all of the data points that have been measured. So I would say, if I was doing this analysis, that would justify bin analysis in the region from 20 to 25 meters per second, in which case the average would be some 2 dB lower than that trend line produces. So again, it's an ambiguity that creeps in because the standard allows individual interpretation without being prescriptive.
Okay. And my last question on these slides is this. Now, you're correlating, if I understand this correctly, MacArthur wind farm generation capacity on these particular days, and the measured L90 sound levels measured by Sonus at D37. Is that what this is showing?
Yeah, this is in one particular night in a northerly wind blowing from the wind farm to the receiver, and it starts at about 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, and then progressively it increases after midnight, throughout the night, and then decreases in the early morning. So the orange curve is basically the power output from the MacArthur wind farm.
Yep.
And it looks as though it's slipped to the right compared to the L90 data. And that's because the AEMO data is measured on the end of every 5-minute period, and the noise measurements are the start of every 10-minute period. So there's a bit of a shift.
Okay, so presumably it was pretty windy or for MacArthur to be generating power at the time that's described on this slide, yes?
That's exactly. So what I did was have a look at the wind speed that was prevalent from the wind speed data that was provided for the Willatook wind farm site.
Yep.
And wind speed at 169 meters hub height turned out to be 18 meters per second when it reached its maximum there. So that's why I then referred back to that background chart and chose the 18 meter per second average background value and corrected this result with that background level, which means that the maximum sound level from the MacArthur wind farm reduced down to about 44 dB rather than 45.
When I look at this, you've described and you've acknowledged there has to have been windy for MacArthur wind farm to be generating. The LA90 measured at D37, it could have other noise sources. It could be wind in the trees or something else in the vicinity of the logger. That's got to be right, surely.
Well, there's a potential, but as I say, the whole objective of the New Zealand standard is that it's intended to correct for the background level. And the background level that was measured in 2010 at 18 meters per second, I did use to correct that data, but it still remained a situation where the MacArthur wind farm at this location was generating 44 decibels as an L90. Now, that, by the way, that is an L90. Sonus have actually used a prediction for the sound level at this location from the MacArthur wind farm, and their prediction is in terms of LEQ. Now, the LEQ should be at least 1.5 to 2 dB higher than the L90s. So the discrepancy from the Sonus predictions for this location is 37 to 44.
Yep.
So there's 7 dB, but then you've got to add on the discrepancy for the LEQ, which is at least 2 dB, say. So
they might need to reply to you on that.
Yeah. So all I'm saying is that the Sonus modeling, which is why I've got an issue with this using G equals 0.5. The model to be so wrong can have a number of things wrong with it. Wrong input parameters, and that might include the sound power of the wind turbines. So the MacArthur wind turbines might be much louder than anticipated.
Okay, now just going back to, I'm going to finish up in a moment, but you've given expert evidence at the planning inquiry hearing for Stockyard Hill.
Yes, I have.
And you gave evidence for, I think, the Mitchell family company who opposed their project. Is that right?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, and you gave expert evidence.
Just to correct, my expert evidence isn't. It was commissioned by them, but it was for the benefit of the panel.
No, I understand that. I did say that they opposed the project. I wasn't saying you were. At Yallock South Wind Farm, you were called by Mr. and Mrs. Olsen, the owner of a neighbouring and equestrian property to Yallock South, at the planning inquiry for that hearing. Is that right? Do you recall that?
Yes, that was quite a while ago.
We had the hearing in Ballarat. I think it was the first time I met you, and they opposed that project. Is that right?
Well, they were questioning the effect on their horses, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, the inquiry should show Wish can go and read the panel report if they want to check that. You gave evidence at the Lau Lau Wind Farm permit amendment inquiry hearing in 2017, giving evidence for the Lau Lau Environment Protection Association. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And they opposed the wind farm permit amendment in that case. That's right, isn't it?
Well, yes. They were objecting to the. Well, no, I'm just saying they were objecting to the increase in size of the turbines.
That's right.
Which was being proposed. That's right.
That's right. And in Dolburn, much more recently, you were called as an expert for Strzelecki Community Alliance, and they weren't very happy about that wind farm either, were they?
No, they weren't.
And you were called to give expert evidence for the Allens, Mr. and Ms. Allen, on the Mortlake South Wind Farm Permit Amendment Panel Inquiry as an expert witness. Do you recall that?
Yes, that permit amendment was again to increase the height of the turbines, correct?
And they objected to the increase of the height.
Mr. Power, first get a name, I just missed that name.
Mortlake South Wind Farm. It's 2017 PPV 14. And they opposed the increase in turbine height for Mortlake South, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And you were called as an expert witness by Adarina Proprietary Limited, which was a neighbouring landowner and objected to the Dundonnell Wind Farm. And you gave evidence of the Dundonnell Wind Farm panel inquiry. Do you recall that?
Yes, I think you were in attendance on that as well.
I was. And they opposed that project, yes?
Yes. And
you gave expert evidence for two objectors at the panel inquiry for the Moorabool Wind Farm back in 2010, so we're going back a while. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And the Olsons and the Wills, who you were represented at that case, opposed that project, yes?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. And for the Stockyard Hill Wind Farm planning permit call-ins at the panel inquiry in 2017, you were called as an expert witness for the Stockyard Hill Community Guardians and for Ms. Hawke at that panel inquiry. Do you recall that?
Yes, that was for another increase in the height of the turbines from the permit that was allowed.
That's right. And your clients objected to the proposed increase in turbine height, yes?
Yes, that's right.
And going back to Cherry Tree Wind Farm, I think you explained earlier that you were called by the Warborough Foundation just to address your infrasound measurements. That's I've got that right, haven't I?
Yes, it was narrowly just listing the results that I just measured for infrasound.
Oh, I remember, because it was tabled over my vociferous objection because I had no notice. So I recall it well. But the Warborough Foundation was a vociferous opponent of that project, yes?
I believe so.
And in South Australia, you gave expert evidence in the ERD court hearing for the Allendale East Wind Farm for the Poltridge family. That's right?
Yes, that's right.
And they opposed that project. That's right?
Yes, they did.
And would the inquiry be right to understand that either the planning permits or the proposed increase in turbine heights were actually granted for all of those projects that I've just gone through?
The one in South Australia was not approved.
But it wasn't because of your evidence, was it?
No, but I'm just saying that it wasn't approved. Yeah. I think you said you believe that all of them were approved, and that one wasn't.
It was refused, but for other reasons, yes.
The other situation with regards to the Stockyard Hill inquiry, the inquiry decided that permit conditions that were determined from a previous panel should be maintained and included in conditions going forward for the increased height of the turbines. Okay. Unfortunately, what turns out was that the minister ignored those recommendations and took out a whole swathe of the conditions that the panel recommended.
Perish the thought that the Minister for Planning would never accept the advice of a panel or inquiry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no further questions.
Thank you. Mr. Houston, we're going to take a break, 15 minutes, and we'll come back at 3:15 p.m. for questions from Member West. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Welcome back. Houston, the final questions will be from the inquiry and panel through Member West. Thank you, Member West. You're on mute, Mr. West.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hewson. I don't have too many questions to ask, so I'll just share my screen, make it easier to go through them. Can you see that background analysis slide that you presented earlier?
Yes, I can.
So in that, you're talking about the scatter, and you can see from the R squared value that it's fairly low at 0.1347, so it's quite low. While we're trying to comply with the New Zealand standard, how do you think we can get a better value curve out of the background noise measurements?
Well, the first thing is, I don't believe that you should limit the trend curve to data only up to, let's say, 15 meters per second. The reason that I say that is that data higher than 15 meters per second has an influence on the location of that trend line. So all of the data that has been measured ought to be included in a background analysis. So that's one improvement. The other improvement should be that if you do bin analysis, then you have a much better understanding of what's happening within the data that you've got. So just to give you an example, if you did 1 meter per second bin at, say, 7 meters per second on that chart, what you'll find is that there's a compression of noise down at the 30 dB region, which might indicate that you've got some compression of the noise measurement system. What you would expect is a normal distribution in any vertical 1 meter per second bin width across any of these 1 meter samples. If you have bin analysis, it would give you extra information as to whether there's compression at one end or the other. It would assist in getting rid of outliers. It gives you greater confidence if there are other trends within the data. And it would also allow you to, for example, in this situation, where you've got 20 to 25 meters per second, if you did bin analysis individually for each 1 meter per second from 20 to 25, you'll find that the resulting data points from which you would then produce a trend analysis would not follow this basic line that's shown here. It would be lower. So to improve it, I'd say use the full wind speed measurement range, and I'd prefer bin analysis on these things.
The background noise levels are important for compliance later on, are they?
Yes, they are.
Because at the end of the day, someone will have to do some measurements for compliance monitoring, and that background curve will need to be included. Given that there's 2010 data and 2017, and if we recommend in the planning permits that we do some more background data, should it be, how would we go about including all the data and establishing the curve, basically the background curve?
Right, I think it's problematic now to do background measurements unless you turn off surrounding influences like the MacArthur wind farm. So in this situation, for example, if you have noise levels in terms of LA90 that are up to 45 decibels, there's obviously an influence from the MacArthur wind farm that doesn't represent true background. The New Zealand standard requires a background to be representative of no wind farms operating in the area. So it's problematic measuring background now, because you'd have to do on-off testing with MacArthur off and then you'd have to convince them. And I think that's going to be problematic for a condition for a different wind farm.
So by specifying in the permit conditions that we do noise measurements now, could we say the lowest of the data sets available will be used for background noise measurement or background curve development?
Yes, I've seen background measurements taken over multiple years at different locations around other wind farms. And from time to time, you have different background trend lines produced. And more often than not, it's affected due to seasonal variation. But one of the assessment methodologies there was basically to say, well, if any of the background noise measurements were higher than other background measurements, you always choose the lower one for your conditioning. So if there are two measurement locations, as you say, 2010 or 2017, you choose the result that gives you the lowest background level. That's a conservative assessment, I believe.
Okay, I think I get that one. It's going to be fairly hard. Just looking at your amplitude modulation. Sorry, in this lower graph here, what was the absolute noise level? Do you remember?
No, I haven't done the full analysis on that. I've got the data and I can work out what the amplitude modulation is. But what I would focus on is the, you see the large peak at about 80 hertz.
Yep.
On the bottom chart. And that's the strong horizontal line at the bottom of the orange chart.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
I did an assessment of the amplitude modulation within that particular tone, so to speak, that third octave band, and it did show that there was demonstrable amplitude modulation in accordance with the standard.
Is amplitude modulation just something that wind farms have?
Yes, in the UK, ETSU R97. Yes, it is inherent, but the original New Zealand standard required that the standard is only applicable for use in situations where you don't observe amplitude modulation. That's section 5 of the original standard in 1998. It was believed originally that, yes, it's only a minor observation that you get from wind turbines, but over the years, the wind industry has been forced to accept that amplitude modulation is a significant effect, and hence we've now got things like the conditions in the 2010 standard.
And that's where you've got the difference between peak and trough, and you work from that. So if the peak and trough is 4 decibels or something like that, then you don't have amplitude modulation. Sorry, is that what you're saying? Because I mean, you still hear it at that.
Yes. So what the standard is suggesting is that amplitude modulation might be a normal feature of the sound from a wind farm and a wind turbine, but that it only warrants a penalty if the peak to trough level as an A-weighted level exceeds 5 decibels, or 6 decibels if it's in third octave bands. So what the standard is saying quite simply is that, yes, it accepts that you do get amplitude modulation from wind turbines, but we're going to ignore anything that's less than 5 dB. Above that, we would apply a penalty.
Thank you. Going back to, and this is probably my last question, seeing Mr. Power's questioning was very thorough. Going back to this permit condition 12 in the permit approved in February 2016. Which particular wind farm was that?
That one's the Salt Creek Wind Farm. I think I referenced it in my statement, yes. And the actual permit number, I think I referenced in my statement as well.
The proponent has recommended that they will be only going for 40 dBA L90 and not using +5 on background. That will get rid of that condition there. Would it be feasible to have 40 dBA L90 limit, including all the potential SACs?
Well, that's normally, so there are other conditions that have been, imposed on other wind farms, and they have a section where it says that if it's demonstrated that the area warrants an assessment of high amenity in accordance with, and then they reference the section of the New Zealand standard, then that would modify this 40 dB limit in section 12A of this standard. So that's another condition that's commonly in some of the recent wind turbine conditions that I've seen.
I was thinking of trying to reduce the amount of debate on whether it's tonal, intermittent, whatever. If we just have if the permit condition was just a straight 40 dB without including any corrections for SACs and things like that. So if, for example, the turbine is tonal and it's making more noise, then it still has to achieve 40 dB.
Well, the issue here is that the way the New Zealand standard is coined is that this base limit of 40 dB, if that's appropriate, depending on whether it's a high amenity or not, if it was 40 decibels and someone measured, let's say, 40 decibels from a compliance assessment, but then they noticed that there were SACs, then the standard would apply a penalty to the measured results, and then you'd get non-compliance. So doing what you suggest in ignoring SACs wouldn't be in accordance with the standard.
Okay. In B, 12B, there's a sleep protection purposes. 10% of the night amounts to a breach of conditions. Isn't that the day as well? So
no, it's only nighttime. Obviously, I suppose you can get people on night shifts and so on, but fundamentally, it's a condition that's coined for these short-term events. So you might have meteorological conditions that are adversely affecting a particular dwelling and a resident, and the reasoning behind that target limit is that, and this has also been upheld in the urine case in the Supreme Court, that averaging data over a couple of weeks doesn't assess the true impact on a particular person. It's the short-term events that cause sleep disturbance that matter. So since the standard is designed or intended to protect sleep, one of the things that you can do is have a condition such as this, where if more than 10% of the night exceed the target noise limits, then that's demonstrated to be a non-compliant situation.
okay. With respect to measurements, would it be useful to add a condition that requires the real-time recording of the noise at the same time as the measuring noise level? Excuse me.
Absolutely. So in accordance with the standard, if you are to assess tonality, if you don't rely on someone just saying, oh, well, I listened to it and it was okay, and you have objective measurements, then it's a requirement that you do audio recordings of at least 2 minutes in every 10-minute sample. And that is something that is essential in my view, in that whenever you do compliance testing, you actually record audio, because that's the only way that you can objectively test for amplitude modulation, tonality, and even impulsiveness.
And you can apply filters and determine those sets quite easily.
Yes, you can.
I think we've done G equals 0 or 1. I have no further questions, Mr. Chair.
Member West, I'll just check with Mr. Fetter. Do you have any re-examination?
Just a few bits and pieces, if I may. Mr. Hewson, I'll go back to the start of Mr. Power's cross-examination, and he asked you some questions about the high amenity rule in the standard. I'll just put that on the screen so everyone can see it again. And although you were asked some questions about the commentary, of course, you pointed out that this is the normative part of the standard. Could you just explain briefly what is it that is special about this location that justifies, in your view, the high amenity limit?
Well, if we look at the D17, for example, D17 has sound levels that are in the vicinity of 31, 32 decibels, L90, at high wind speeds from 20 to 25 meters per second, and that's from measurements by Sonus. If the predicted noise levels are in excess of 8 dB above the noise level, then that would automatically trigger this high amenity objective test. But you just got to remember that the objective test in the standard for high amenity areas is a comment. So although it's normative in terms of the section 5.3.1, the comment to that is actually only a comment. It's not normative. So the normative section of high amenity areas is, in special circumstances, at some noise sensitive locations, a more stringent noise limit may be justified to afford a greater degree of protection of amenity during evening and nighttime. So what they're saying in the normative section is that 40 dB is a recommended level, but there are areas that would warrant lower baseline noise limits. And it doesn't specify what they are. And then it includes this comment. And the comment is a comment suggesting an objective test, but at the end of the day, it's still a comment. So the actual normative objective is in special circumstances. And I believe that special circumstances are when you have an area with really no low noise limits. Well, not noise limits, but a low noise environment, such as we've seen in some of the measurements here.
Okay, thank you. Next, you were tackled on the EPA guideline that you hadn't seen. I'll put that on the screen. I don't have Mr. Power's version, but I do have the website. So if you just bear with me, I'll pull that up. Here it is. Can you see the EPA website there? And I'll scroll to the top. Do you see wind energy?
Yes.
Good.
Yes, I can. Yeah.
And you pointed out the disclaimer before, but I'll just quickly show you this part of it. Using this guide provides an outline of the requirements that apply to noise under the new regulations. It's intended to assist operators to decide what best suits their circumstances. it doesn't impose compliance obligations. It's designed to help you understand obligations under the Act, and it forms part of a capital S state of knowledge, capital K, about the general environmental duty. Now, bearing in mind that you haven't seen it before, are you able to say whether this document was authored by EPA's acousticians rather than its lawyers, or you just don't know who's behind it?
Well, historically, about 10 years ago, the EPA admitted that they had little experience in wind farm noise, and they put out a tender for a document to interpret the application of the New Zealand standard. That was won by a couple of consultants, and they produced a guideline for the EPA. And I was asked to review those guidelines. The EPA were close to cancelling the project and basically almost asking for their money back. But the end result was that the EPA didn't have a guideline at that time, and they admitted that they didn't have the experience in wind farm noise. Now, I don't know if they've developed wind farm experience since that time, but presumably they've sought advice from somewhere. Now, they may have invited some consultants to give them advice on it, or they may have in-house experience now. I just don't know.
Okay, thank you. Now, Mr. Power took you to this document on this issue of whether the high energy or how the high energy limit should be applied and what regard should be had to cherry tree. You remember that, yes?
Yes, I do.
And you acknowledge that this guidance from the EPA was at least relevant, remember?
Yes.
So now that you have seen the EPA's guidance, does that change the opinion you expressed in your statement in any way?
No, it doesn't.
Okay. All right, I'll close.
Can I just amplify that a little more?
Of course.
In New Zealand, obviously, where this standard hails from, panels have also decided that farming zones are also capable of being classed as high amenity. So even in New Zealand, their own interpretation of their own standard has shown that they've fallen down on the situation that farming areas can be high amenity areas. So it's not just the Narrogid decision. It's also common in New Zealand as well.
Well, that prompts me to ask, if, for instance, you had a property in the farming zone, but it was near a busy highway, would you, in that hypothetical situation, regard a location like that as attracting high amenity treatment?
No, I wouldn't, no.
Okay. All right, then Mr. Power asked you a number of questions about SONIS's noise predictions. Now, first of all, are you aware of other noise predictions that have been made for other wind farms by SONIS and other acousticians?
Yes, I am.
And are you able to say whether the predictions in other cases have come to pass, whether they're accurate or not?
Yes, and the reason that I put in my presentation those examples are actual examples of where the predictions have not come to pass. And the primary one that I'm referring to is SONIS have predicted 37 dB for noise from the MacArthur wind farm at D37. Yet it's pretty obvious that that's a way underestimate of the actual situation. So it could be a fault of the sound power level going into the model, but I suspect more than that it would be an incorrect use of the ground absorption factor and the receiver height.
Okay. And you were then asked about the sound power levels from the turbines, and your opinion is that independent testing is needed, correct?
Yes, but moreover, it should be independent testing of the actual one that's going to be installed.
I got that, but hang on, that's just a lead up to my actual question. The actual question is simply, do you know what's involved with that independent testing? Is it a big deal? Does it take a long time, or is it something that is done relatively quickly and inexpensively?
I've seen independent test results that have been completed in an afternoon.
Okay. And are you aware of a case where a customer's asked a manufacturer to do the independent testing?
Yes. So often a manufacturer of the turbines will offer them for sale to a client, and the client would be the developer, presumably, of the wind farm. And there would be contractual arrangements between them. And obviously the developer will not want to have the risk of very noisy turbines when they've been promised that they're not. So more often than not, there is a contractual arrangement which stipulates the requirements on the manufacturer. That's something that is difficult to condition. And it also falls over when you have the developer as being the manufacturer as well of the turbines, in which case you don't have that little element of protection.
All right, but you're not suggesting that's the case here, are you?
No, what I'm suggesting here is that a candidate turbine's been chosen, and I think Mr. Evans from Resonate Acoustics has said, well, that is an example wind turbine of that capacity that's on the lower end of what might be available. He suggested that typically it might be 108 dB, and Sonus have used 104 dB. So you can choose the quietest turbine, there's no doubt about that, but at the end of the day, proper test results are required. All
right. I'll move to the next issue. You'll remember about the ISO approach, and you explained that G equals 0, in your view, had to be paired with the receiver height, particular receiver height. Can I just get you to clarify what the receiver height refers to? Because I had put to Mr. Turnbull that it's the height that you're essentially, in a noise prediction model, it's the height that you're modeling the sound at, and he disagreed with me because I put to him that 1.5 meters was appropriate given that's the height of a person, and he, as I understood it, was saying no, receiver height is nothing to do with the height of the ears or the person experiencing the sound. So first of all, over to you. Could you just explain for the panel what the receiver height is?
Right, the receiver height is the point at which the microphone sits above the ground when you're doing background testing or compliance testing. And that's a requirement within the standard that it's 1.5 meters.
Well, hang on, just so we're not at cross purposes. I was tackling Mr. Turnbull about his coloured diagrams showing the noise predictions. You know the contour maps I'm speaking of?
Yeah, the contour charts, yeah.
Yes,
okay.
and I had put to him that he had made a mistake in using a 4-meter receiver height because I put to him that human ears were at 1.5 meters, and so 1.5 had to be used. And he suggested in his answer that it had nothing to do with where the hypothetical listener was going to be. So could you explain, for the purpose of noise prediction, what the receiver height refers to?
Yeah, the receiver height refers to the point at which you are subsequently going to take measurements. So in a compliance assessment, if you're testing compliance with predicted levels, if your predicted levels are at 4 meters, then presumably you would be testing compliance at 4 meters high with your microphones. In Australia, and using the standard, 1.5 is the location at which you put your microphone. So all predictions should be based on 1.5. And if you look at the other model that was used by Sonus, they used Konkawi, and their receiver height was 1.5 meters.
And just to be clear, all other things being equal, if I come down from 4 meters to 1.5, is the sound from the turbine at the same distance going to be greater or less?
It's greater because you get greater reflection from the ground in front of you.
Okay, thank you. You've cleared that one up, I think. The second last question is just, you were asked some questions about subjective versus objective testing for SACs. You remember that?
Yes.
And I just wanted to put on the screen the New Zealand standard and just have you confirm so there's no doubt about it. Sorry, that's not the right page. Here it is. Which parts you're saying are objective and which are subjective, because if I can go through this with you, we start in Appendix B, and there's the explanation there that you can have, and it's in the box here, I'll call them tones, impulses, or AM. They're the three sorts of SACs, correct?
Yes, that's right.
And then the standard there says that subjective assessment can be sufficient in some circumstances. So just, you weren't asked about impulses. Can you explain to the panel how is impulsive sound tested for? Is it a subjective or objective approach?
It's a rate of change of the sound level over a certain period. So if the sound level exceeds 10% change, sorry, not 10%, if the sound level went from, let's say, 30 decibels to 40 decibels in less than 1 second, then that's considered impulsive.
Okay. But that's not in the New Zealand standard itself. There's no reference in this Appendix B to that method. That must be from somewhere else, is it?
Right, so Australian Standard 1055 gives you an assessment method for that. Okay. And also British Standard 4142 also gives you an assessment method for impulsiveness. But
that's objective in the sense that any acoustician applying the method properly should arrive at the same result, correct?
The objective of a standard should give you that, but when you start introducing subjective assessment, then you have problems.
All right. Let me just then make clear, going to tonality, I think you had said in your answer that you saw tonality as tested objectively. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Just, I wanted to direct you to these words, if there is doubt about the presence of tonality, and just ask you, does that mean, or am I reading it wrong? I had read that as suggesting that the first test is a listening test, and if the acoustician listening has no doubt about it, they don't need to proceed to the computer-based testing that follows. How do you understand that?
Yes, that's my interpretation. In effect, what that's saying is, if a person's a bit uncertain about his subjective observation, then you do an objective test. But the issue here is quite. If I can just clarify something, SACs are to be assessed in every 10-minute period. So it's impossible for a person to do a subjective test in every 10-minute period through a survey, unless you record every 10-minute period and a person sits there for 4 weeks listening to them. So that's just impractical. So more often than not, you have a computer that does an analysis of objective test methods for tonality, impulsiveness, and amplitude modulation. And that could be done on a computer for every 10-minute sample. It's just impractical for someone to subjectively assess every 10-minute period in a survey period.
I understand that, but what about the other way around, where there's clearly a fault with the turbine, it's emitting a continuous grinding tonal sound that never stops? In that case, in your understanding, is it sufficient just to say, well, I hear a continuous tone, I don't need now to proceed to the computer-based test, I will now apply a penalty of 6 dB at all times? Is that a proper, in your opinion, approach to applying B2.1?
Yes, that's the approach of all the special audible characteristics. There is that subjective option,
yes,
but What I keep repeating is that different observers will have different impressions.
Yes, and that's why we're calling it subjective, because there's not a single answer that every reasonable person would come to doing the same test.
Yeah, if I can give you an example, if someone's driven to a site in a car playing rap music or something really loud in his car, what happens is that his hearing automatically attenuates. I mean, your body does that. So your hearing becomes less sensitive. If he gets out of the car, sticks his equipment out and goes, "Oh, it sounds all right to me," then that's not the same as someone who's been living in a quiet environment, who's accustomed to the quiet. So the impression from even an experienced acoustician might be different.
Yes. And last one on this, just to complete it with amplitude modulation. I understood you to say that there was an objective test for that one, correct?
Yes, and it's in the normative section, so it's B3.2, that test method there.
Well, I just wanted, though, to draw your attention to the first part, B3.1, which again, if you read this highlighted part, seems to me to start off with a subjective threshold test that an acoustics advisor can listen. And for instance, if it's just clear as the nose on your face that it's there, that you don't have to proceed. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, yes, that's the understanding. And again, the same issue arises. You know, different people have different opinions.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. Please keep going.
And also that you're supposed to do an SAC in every 10-minute period. So, you know, and unless it's there and it's in your face, I mean, the question then arises, well, okay, it might be in your face and you can say, God, that's horrible. But then 10 minutes later, when you've left, it's gone quiet.
Yes. And then let's say you proceed to do the computer-based test, and you find that the peak to trough levels are only going up and down by 5.9 decibels. My reading of the next part is that you can still go on to consider reasonableness and nevertheless conclude that in these circumstances, that is the sort of AM that should attract a penalty. Now, I'm inviting you to comment on that and tell me if you share that understanding or not.
Well, that's what the standard says, is that consideration should be given. Now, that could be reasonable, affirmative, or negative. In other words, you know, you might hear some clear, let's say, amplitude modulation and think, well, under the circumstances, I don't think that is warranted. But the key issue here is that it refers to this reasonableness under Section 16 of the Resource Management Act, which is obviously in New Zealand legislation. So again, it just introduces so many problems when you're referring to legislation from another country.
I'm pretty sure reasonable over the ditch means the same thing as here, but what I have in mind is, for instance, you might have found excessive AM, but only here and there on a couple of samples, and you might consider that that's a reasonable amount. Whereas if you heard it 90% of the time at 5.9 decibels, you might say, well, it doesn't quite meet the 6 decibel test, but it's present all of the time, and in those circumstances it's an unreasonable amount of AM. Is that also your understanding of what a reasonableness assessment might look like?
Yeah, that's what I think is a reasonable assessment, but bear in mind that the standard is designed to protect sleep. Now, sleep, this is why I refer to that section in that example condition that I showed, which was 12B, I think it was, where you've got 10% of the night not complying. Now, in any particular night, if you've got SACs on some nights but not on others, then you apply penalties to those particular nights. And so it comes out in the wash in the analysis method, and it's particular to protecting someone's amenity from disturbed sleep.
Okay. All right, and the last question is, you were asked about infrasound, and you made reference to the 1998 New Zealand standard, where you said that it only applied where there was no amplitude modulation. But I just put on the screen the section that I think you might have had in mind, and just get you to confirm whether or not that's right. Sorry, Zoom's causing me trouble here. So this is, I'll show you the first page. You're happy, this is the 1998 standard you were referencing?
Yes, that's right.
And if I go back to it's page 10 of the document, there's this section here that says, well, you can see post-installation sound compliance testing. It outlines a method for testing in the far field, i.e. at distances where the cyclic variations due to blade rotation are no longer discernible. Is that the section that you had in mind?
Yes, in effect, what that's saying is that if you can hear amplitude modulation at the location that you're considering compliance testing at, then you shouldn't use that standard.
Yes, all right. Well, we'll make that available to the panel in due course. Thank you very much, Mr. Hewson. That's all from me.
Thank you, Mr. Peter. If we could just stop the recording. Thank you.